Buenos días a todos. Vamos a comenzar este seminario. Es un gusto tenerlos a todos ustedes. Realmente tenemos un seminario y posteriormente una mesa de discusión con expertos en el tema. Este tema yo creo que da para mucho de debate. Hay muchos estudios que se han hecho no solo en México, sino a nivel global, y hay muchos aprendizajes y yo creo que es una oportunidad para reflexionar sobre qué es lo que sigue, ¿no? El título de este seminario es Paying for Nature, 20 Years of Mexico Payments for Ecosystem Services Program. Y bueno, va a ser un seminario que tenga algunas ponencias en inglés, otras en español. Pueden hacer sus preguntas en cualquiera de los dos idiomas, sin ningún problema. Los que estén en línea en YouTube, pues también pueden hacernos llegar sus comentarios y preguntas. Aquí el equipo del instituto nos hará llegar las preguntas y las podemos transmitir a los ponentes. Pues uno de los principales objetivos de este seminario, como yo decía, es reflexionar sobre los aprendizajes, pero no solo eso, sino podrán ver que a lo largo del seminario pues hay estudios de caso para varios estados, lo cual pues hace muy interesante esta reflexión. Por mi parte, yo creo que les doy la más cordial bienvenida y le doy la palabra a Santiago para que expanda un poquito más la introducción de este seminario. Gracias.
Okay, I'll do my welcome in English. Thanks everyone for being here. Welcome to this international seminar, Paying for Nature, 20 Years of Mexico's Payment for Ecosystem Services Program. The theme that brings us together is this program, PES, in Mexico, and we as a community of PES scholars and practitioners, some would go as far as to say that we are PES enthusiasts. We've been studying and analyzing this program over and over again. So we know quite a lot about this program, and the thematic panels of this seminar reflect this knowledge. So we will go from trying to understand what this program has achieved over the last 20 years, how it has evolved in terms of design implementation, what are some of the regional diversity in terms of outcomes and processes. So this is a bit looking towards the past. But I also want to urge presenters and participants today to really reflect on what are potential futures for the program. We know that it's facing a bit of uncertainty from reduced funding to potential dismantling. And we want to reflect what are some feasible or desirable futures for the program. So let's take this opportunity to reflect on what we know so far, but how can we move forward, if any? With that, we'll start with the first presentation. So if Jerome, you could come to the panel, and I'll introduce you. Welcome, Jerome. So first, we'll have an introductory talk by Professor Duprat. Jerome Duprat is a professor in the Department of Natural Sciences at the Université du Québec in Ottawa, and holds the Canada Research Chair in Ecological Economics. He leads a lab of 25 graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and research professionals focusing on land use planning, biodiversity protection, and political ecology. So welcome, Jerome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Santiago. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you for this invitation. Thank you, Sophie, Andrea, Liz, for the organization and the coordination. All right. So we're here to talk about paying for nature, but this is embedded in a larger context. I think this study published 3 weeks ago really resumed quite well in what the situation we are all together. The safe and just Earth system boundaries. So that was published by the group at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and exploring what are the limits, the planetary boundaries. And the conclusion of this study, in a nutshell, is that we are exceeding 7 of these 8 limits in terms of biodiversity, climate change, loading of the watersheds in terms of phosphorus, nitrogen, invasive species. So we're discussing, knowing that this is the situation. This is factually the situation, and we have international discussion, the COPs in terms of climate change and biodiversity. In Montreal, in last December, was held the COP 15, so dedicated to biological diversity. And the goal was to establish a new framework for biodiversity. So after the Aichi targets and the Nagoya Protocol, this agreement from Kunming to Montreal due to the COVID pandemic, this was from China to Canada. But after 2 weeks of negotiation, this new agreement is composed of 4 goals and 23 action-oriented targets. So we've talked a lot about this goal of protecting 30% of the land and land, seas, and inland water for the coming years, for 2030, restoring 30% of the ecosystem. But there is one target, again 19, that is specifically dedicated to our today's topic. So this target is stating that we should stimulate innovative schemes such as payment for ecosystem services, green bonds. And for being there during these 2 weeks, I can tell that the sustainable finance actor from at the global scale were there and asking for different strategies to invest into biodiversity conservation. So we've been discussing PES for 20 years, but this is still really actual and contemporary. And we need this discussion among different stakeholders, from academic, practitioner, investors, decision makers. So I've asked ChatGPT to give us a mainstream definition of PES, and it did quite well. In fact, we can see like the very generic topics that we've been navigating with for the past 2 decades. So we have here a scheme and mechanism to pay for the benefits that people receive from ecosystem. This is dedicated to specific thematics such as water, climate change through carbon, conservation, soil fertility. It's a trade mechanism between providers and beneficiaries. Payments can be made through cash subsidies, incentives. And the goal is to create a win-win situation. So I think that we have a full day to debate what means a win-win situation and what are these conditions and success factor. And this last part to me is maybe the most interesting that AI is giving us. It's really context-based, and the objectives and context really depends on the multiple factors. So I'm just wanted to state the place with this definition to go with more subtleties in the coming slides. Just to look at the last decade on PS research with our group, we've created a database which is called epistemology. So the aim is to do a systematic review of the literature on PES. In the past 4 years, a team based in Belgium and in Canada reviewed more than 1,000 peer-reviewed papers dedicated to PES. And this is done in parallel with a real appetite and desire on PES. So you can see that the industry is already investing dozens of billions of dollars in these schemes worldwide. So and you can see that the literature is really growing into the past year, from early 2000 with the seminal papers in 2005, 2007, and now growing literatures that we can count on over 150 papers a year published on this thematic. So a really quick snapshot on 4 figures about what this database is telling us. So it's telling us that the three main services, ecosystem services that are targeted by this program. Once again, this is based on not gray literature, not public report, technical report. It's on the scientific paper. So this is an initial bias, but we can see that biodiversity, wildlife, carbon, and water are the three main ecosystem services on which science and projects of PS are being designed. The most of the publication are targeting Brazil, China, and Mexico. So 7.5% of the literature is targeted to Mexican case studies. So that is pretty interesting, and it tells us that these 20 years of projects and evolution are also recognized in the scientific literature. The objectives, so we had a lot of papers that are looking at the pricing situation. So we want to value the ecosystem services, to establish a design of pricing mechanisms. So you can see that the absolute objective of many of the papers are market-based valuation, the PS effectiveness design, and on the other side, you can see that the emphasis can be it's embracing more largely. The objective are multiple, looking at the additionality, institution, efficiency. So with this general context, I wanted to give you a local appreciation of what are PS in Canada, so we can discuss and compare it with the Mexican studies. So in Canada, most of the PS are designed in the agricultural sector. So here you have a view of the fourth greatest lake in Canada, the Lake Erie, which is 25,000 kilometers square. So it's a very large lake where you can see the blooms, the algal blooms dancing at its surface with many impacts that we can imagine, impacts on fisheries, recreation, water quality. So this is mainly explained by the intensification of agriculture. So in here you have figures of southern Quebec moving from the 50s to 2010s. And you see that there's been a huge transition to extensive and dairy car production to pigs farm, which have impacts on the loading of the watersheds. And that led to a series of, well, increase in fertilizer. So you have a net nitrogen and phosphorus input in watersheds that have been really growing in the past decades. And this is leading to an occurrence of hundreds of these episodes of harmful algal blooms. So we have hundreds of lakes that are transformed in these green spots for 2 or 3 months during summers. So we can respond to that with different strategies. We can have this dance between the ecosystem and the human activities. We can respond to laws and regulation or incentives. So Canada has put in place these like twofold strategies. So we have more robust norms and laws on pesticides and nutrients and etc. But also since 2005, the federal government wanted to try this incentive approach. So from 2005 to 2015, there's been a large set of pilot projects put in place in Canada. So this has been going from carbon offset trading, phosphorus, water quality trading schemes, the annual payments, tax credit auctions. So these 50 or so pilot projects were put in place, were followed, were monitored. And in the end, like in the mid 2010s, a series of academic but also public workers stated that all these pilot projects were designed in a top-down vision. So these top-down visions have the capacity of structuring the place, have interesting monetary envelopes, have the capacity to put project in place, but they lack to be accountable, place-based, efficient, including many partners, and integrate different objectives. So maybe it was focused on water or climate change, but struggle to have multiple other objectives being work at the same time. And if we want to resume this in a single figure, the critique was to say that we've spent a lot of money, millions of dollars, to pay for the practice, so to implement beneficial practices, but no monitoring was done and no assessment of this impact was made. So the different authors in the scientific literature, but also from the political system, made a public call for being able to close the loop. So to have PES, they stated that PES has a lot of potential, but need to be monitored in a way to get more efficiency, more ecological and economic efficiency. So in that context, with our group, we designed different research projects, asking how could we think or develop sustainable, efficient, and place-based PES using this socio-ecological framework. So this is some kind of a wicked problem. It's a complex system, but we've put in place different activity in boxes. So looking at the ecological aspect, socioeconomic one, institutional, and assessing the preference of different stakeholders, the farmers, citizens, public workers. So I'm just going to give you a quick snapshot of the work made by the students and postdoc in the lab, just to be able for us together to address the complexity and the quality of the reflection that we need to put in place PES that have this more community-based approach, that have the grassroots capacities to address the problems that were stated in the first 10 years of pilot projects. So a little case study in southern Quebec. You see in the gray section, this is the city of Montreal with 4 million people living there, and this is a large watershed. This is the border from Canada and United States, and this is the Lake Champlain, a large lake that is co-managed between the two countries. So it's co-managed. This is adding a level of complexity, but we've tried within these 4 boxes to address certain of these aspects. One first study we did was to be able to acknowledge, to embrace the economic and ecological efficiency of different activities. So we've used the RIOS model, which is an economic optimization model that is working with different constraints. So we look at the efficiency of different agricultural practices, the constraint of the size, the budget constraints, and this is how it works. So we look at the different size of buffers, so 5, 10, 25 meters buffers, some other strategies to capture the phosphorus and nitrogen, so control drainage or cover crops. And we've looked at different constraints in terms of investment of these practices, of the slope, the drainage capacity. And this took 2 years for a postdoc in the lab to really calibrate, to parameterize the software for this study site. And thereafter, we can ask RIOS to tell us where we should implement what activity, what agro-environmental practice, to be the more efficient in terms of money, but also in the quality, in increasing the water quality. So if we are having scenarios of working at the level of 1,000 hectares, this is where we should act. 3,005 up to 10,000 hectares and 15,000 hectares. So you see appearing these different solutions and strategy. And this is helping us to have the capacity to target where on different sites we should put different solutions. So it moves from spreading to have space for practices with no monitoring, to really look at where we should invest and then see the return on investment. this return on investment was measured through the mesh software. So it's measuring ecosystem services for human well-being. So when we plant trees, when we put in place cover crops, we also have positive impact on ecosystem services that we can measure in terms of carbon storage, export of sediment, phosphorus, the water provisioning. And in the end, we can have a more informed discussion on these constraints budget and the impact on the watershed. So we see that at the actual level of investment, so on the 5-year terms, we invest in this region more or less $2.5 million. We can see that it's money, it's a lot of people that are implicated in the projects, but the effect in the watershed is really marginal. So we have very few impact on sediment, on phosphorus. So it's really paying for the practice. It's like dilapidating the resources. If we want to have a real impact, we should move from a more significant budget to have 15, 20% impact on phosphorus and nitrogen. But this is a public call for investing way more in the agricultural sector in terms of environmental protection. Knowing that the Quebec budget, the whole budget is $125 million over a period of 5 years. That will mean that for the whole province, we should take that budget and invest it in one single watershed. So we can conclude that we really lack investment in terms of money, of human resources to have to be able to have a real objective in the watershed. Another study that we've done is to look at the general public. What are their preferences? What do they want in terms of changing the agricultural sectors, implementing this PES program? So we surveyed the population of Quebec and finally having some insights on the preferences. What is the willingness to pay of the general public? On what thematics would they want to see some action? In this case, people really want to have an action towards pesticide and not necessarily for biodiversity or soil conservation. And we did a mirror study for farmers, so asking the same kind of questions with the contracts, with the attributes, and in the end, we concluded that what the general public want is not what the farmer are willing to do. So the term of the contract, people want long-term engagement. Farmers from 1 to 3 years, they want to focus on non-productive agricultural sectors, so like riparian buffers. They are not willing to transform their culture. On the other side, the public really wants this. They want to have a more fundamental transformation. So there's no solution or answer in these two studies. It just points out that we cannot top-down drop a solution because we have these different preferences among the two key stakeholders in that sector, the public and the farmers. We also showed what is demanded for the farmers, all the complexity of navigating into this institutional bricolage. So this figure just resume like a motivated farmer what he or she has to go through to provide some ecosystem services with public or private help. So there are programs, but you need to navigate up to the Canadian and Quebec government, working with your counselor agronomist. You need to apply for different programs that implicate workers' union and etc. And when you are a farmer, and for those who are intimate with their activities, they are working 12 to 15 hours a day. So where is that time that they can dedicate to understand this ecosystem? So this is like a really a barrier, a entry barrier for the participation of many of these. Another and very interesting study led by Vijay Kalinjivadi, a postdoc in the lab, was to have a real discussion about the context. Because when we're discussing agro-environmental practices, we're looking at maybe the program condition, the design. In this case, we're looking, ALICE is the most popular PS program in Canada, Alternative Land Use Services. So it's present in 7 provinces. Thousands of farmers are being subsidized by this private program to put in place environmental friendly practices. But when we are having this discussion, it's always through the farmers and the local planners, and how can we group together to have this kind of project. It's really at the micro scale, but when we appreciate the more global scale, we can this is a case study in Prince Edward Island, where the main culture is the potato. So we're discussing about Alice, but this is driven by larger scale actors. So McDonald's and Loblaws, Walmart are buying the potatoes from large scale retailer who are setting the condition for increasing production, the way they want the production to be done. And in the end, it's just a really tiny space that is left to have this discussion. However, when we are in these villages, in these landscape, the conversation is not made about should we question this more global pressures and aspects. It's really dedicated to a confrontation between citizens and farmers. In a little bit in the same way, and this is a title that I really like, do you want some fries with your ecosystem services? So the McDonaldization of agriculture in Prince Edward Island. So we have these loops like conflicts between farmers and the general public. And we are here trying to get solution by fine tuning these win-win PES. But in fact, the bottom line is really more at another level. It's to address the fact that the industrial food system is having impacts on the ecosystem, and in the end, the discussion is not made at the right level. The same thing for the creation of new PES program. They are dedicated to a context that is already aligned and very niche, that is not able to accept and address a larger context. So just to conclude, a paper written by Alejandra Zagamendes in her PhD thesis, where she stated that there are social interdependency. So if we want to put in place PES projects, initiatives that can be able in some way to address these questions, these larger contexts, but also have the potentials to be sustainable, we need to recognize these different overarching themes, such as power relation, intermediary, political progress. So this is some kind of a way to do post-normal science. So to know what is the place of science in this economic political discussion. And I just want to conclude by this is a really personal statement, but over the last decade, I've seen really gain and success by having strong dialogues and connection with the political sector. So sometimes it's hard for scientists to get down off our ivory tower and to publish paper. These are difficult conversations to have. We all have our constraints, but creating that channel of confidence and this like vision of post-normal science can have really positive impacts. For instance, in Quebec, this research on many different aspects have been taken by the farmers union, which represent the 40,000 farmers in Quebec, and they really address this question of economic pressure and how to build a more sustainable PES program. We had also very interesting impact on the Quebec government, who developed a new PES initiative. So with our studies saying that we really need more money and more staff, they respond in some way by doubling the budget dedicated to agro-environmental practices through the lens of PES. So there's a space of discussion to be made in this arena of policy and the political sector as well. So thank you very much.
Hello. Okay. Thanks very much, Jerome, for this very fascinating presentation. Congratulations on all the successful research and practitioner work been conducting. We have time for a couple of questions from the public. If anyone has a question for Jerome. Yes, Liz. Just the mic, yeah.
Jerome, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. It was really, I think, especially seeing the connections with the Mexico case, were very clear. So thanks for bringing out the details. I was wondering about your comment about the post-normal science, and especially in the aspect of trying to influence policy. So in your case, or in your experience, what has been some of the most effective strategies at influencing policy around incentive-based conservation?
Thank you, Liz, for the question. Well, I think that the first reflex is to have a posture. As a scientist, I think we have this usual position of being directive, or this is what science is telling us, which is true in many ways, and we need to listen to science. But some contexts may not be ready for this kind of scenario or different steps. We used to work with figures, and this is step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and when we arrive in the reality check, okay, people are farmers and this is their job, and there's a political sector and there's social acceptability. We need to recognize in some way that we don't hold the truth, or this is part of the truth, this is part of the real context. So what we've been doing in the lab is like first a multiplication of being present in some of these arenas. So being present in conference, and seminars, talking to people, going on forum, just to create that link, saying, well, hey, by the way, we've looked at our models and this is really problematic. You think you're doing good by planting these trees, but if we monitor it over time, this doesn't have a real effect. It's not like arriving with the big boots and this is not working. It's trying to navigate to have a passage altogether. So and this is really strongly linked to this community-based approach vision that I think we share here. If we want to, and this was seen in these Canadian top-down pilot projects. We have envelopes, we have programs. This lasts for 5 years, and I've been doing my master research project on it, like following all the good things that were happening in a watershed. And 5 years after, it was returned to the original situation because there were no money, there were no solid bound that were created. It was just a program, an envelope, and people working on site for 5 years. So we need to have some keys to have more sustainable and perennity in these systems. So I think additionality is one of these, creating these links. And this last slide from Alejandra, we need to recognize these like collective space, and it's sometimes tough to put in place in a scientific way or political way or economic one, because this is like targets that are non-measurable in many ways. But yeah, if I can resume, it's just a matter of being there and creating a relation of confidence.
I have a question too. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's nice to see another country, what is going on in another country. It's very helpful. And I have 2 questions. One, you already mentioned a little bit about that in your answer right now. But the first one is about the budget. If we need more budget, where this budget needs to come from the government, from private, from a mixture. If we would like to design another program, how do you imagine that could be? And in that same sense is how people need to be involved and not to have an implementation of the program where people doesn't want to do what they are supposed to do, as you mentioned. So I think if you can say something about that.
Well, there's no single answer to a complex question. So I think but just challenging this relation of the state and the communities. We've been like depending in Canada, and I'm sure it's like shared with many other countries. We've been depending on like public money. So this is a new program, new envelope, and this create like a tension because we're always asking for more. We have like these externalities created by capitalist industry, intensification of agriculture, and the public sector needs to patch these holes with subsidies. So I think we really need to question this model in the way we are practicing agriculture or conservation or forestry. To be more like rooted in ecological economics, but after there's also the reality check. How does we finance that? At the COP15, there was such an appetite for sustainable finance. How can we invest in decarbonating the industry? How can we protect biodiversity by investing? So the worst thing we could do as academia would have to say, oh, this is like private money, it's not good, it will always turn into a capitalist vision. Because if we do so, there will not be that critical perspective that is really way needed, and it will turn out as setting up the place for the market for the market. So I think there's a potential there. There's a really sensitive route that we need to go on all together, the politics, the economical sectors, the scientists, and people who are managing the landscape. But I think we need maybe to open this discussion of having like large scale PES where carbon biodiversity can have buyers at other scales. So and after that, the subsidiary principle that is in the sustainable development, like a key principle, it tells us that if we have a new global framework for biodiversity, these objectives are set by the countries, discussed at an international level, but the solution are put in place at the local level. So we need to like this protection of 30% of the lands, restoring 30%. It needs to be talkative and pragmatic at the local scale. So we need to be looking in different ways to respect the heterogeneity of the landscape of the communities, and this is also true in the way to finance this. So can we think in some way to have like closed loop of finance? Sometimes additionality with private public sector. I think there's no like one single answer that this is how we're gonna. I was like caricaturing a little bit in my time. We need $125 million, but this was like kind of the snapshot to the Ministry of Agriculture. Okay, we've shown that with all your investing, you have no effect. Put some more or think in different ways.
Question from the back.
Thank you. Very quick question. You mentioned something about riparian restoration. If I understood correctly, did you say that it was better accepted by the farmers? And so, what is your take regarding targeting these sort of areas when we are designing this type of projects or programs?
Well, what we've shown in this particular case in southern Quebec is that the people want like transformative change in the way we're doing agriculture. We want to have like biological control and no pesticide. We want to have organic food. This is the public call, with all the other sides that we understand the economic impacts, the effect, the different pressures. But on the other side, the farmers don't want to question the way they are doing their activities because they are in some way locked up with some kind of a recipe. They've bought like machinery. They've bought high yield. They're doing corn and soya, and they don't want to all change this for doing organic agriculture. So they are looking at their situation and where can I have an environmental impact. This is where I don't do I don't do any crops or cultivation. So the non-productive area. So that's why the public programs and the farmers are super willing to do things in the riparian buffers because they don't cultivate anything there. So this is really the tension because the public wants this. They don't want really to pay also what is needed for the transformation. We've been investing historically for decades in a green revolution setting, so to be more performant. And now it's not the fault of the farmers. They've been doing this for more than half a century. So to transform it, that will need a social contract. And this is what this kind of study also illustrate, that we have two really different poles that are opposed. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jerome. And with that, we'll get started right away with our first panel. So I'd like to invite Andrea, Elizabeth, and Sophie to the stage, please.
Okay, so this first panel, it's mainly about many case studies in Mexico, and so that's the way we organize this seminar. A first panel talking about what is going on in Mexico on the PES, not in a specific places, but as a national scale. And the other two panels are more specific in specific watersheds or states. And so the first panel, the first talk is about evolution of policy frameworks and design. And Elizabeth Shapiro Garza from the Duke University will talk about this topic. So I will present each one of you once you start your, just before your presentation, if it's okay for you. So Elizabeth is an associate professor of the practice of environmental policy and management at the Nicholas School of the Environment and serves as the faculty director of Engaged Scholarship at Duke University. She's a human environment geographer whose research explores the ways in which human communities interact with environmental initiatives. She's mainly trained on social sciences with a primary methodological specialization in qualitative methods and analysis. And well, Elizabeth Shapiro has been working in this topic for quite a long time already. So please, Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you so much. Is it? Yeah. Thank you so much. I think first I'd like to thank Sophie and Santiago for the invitation, and also for the Instituto for hosting us today. It's wonderful to be back with so many colleagues who I've known for so long. I've worked on this issue for many years. I think that's why I was asked, actually, is that I'm old. I have been working on this topic since 2005, so that's a long time. So again, it's wonderful to be in conversation with y'all today. What I'll be talking about today is actually a nice follow-on from Dr. Duprat's talk. I will be talking about tensions, persistent tensions, between economic theory of payment for ecosystem services as it's envisioned, and what I call the applied theory, what is actually happening on the ground and how people envision these programs should be and can be realized in Mexico. So again, I'll be providing a very, very short history of payment for ecosystem services programs in Mexico. I think you all are very familiar with them, so I'm not going to go into much detail. You'll also be hearing from other speakers today who will go into more detail. But I'll be talking more about the tensions in, again, the theory of how these things are organized. So this is the very brief history of the National Payment for Ecosystem Services programs. Since 2003, there have been 4 main programs that have been implemented in Mexico by the National Forest Commission, the Comisión Nacional Forestal. One thing to mention too is I did write my slides in Spanish for those of you where that's easier, and I'll be speaking in English, as you can tell. But again, hopefully that will be helpful for those of you whose English is not the first language. So the first program was the National Payment for Ecosystem Services program. It was started in 2003. It's one of the more extensive programs, and it continues today. The early action for Red Plus was started in 2006, and it's a smaller program, but it has been powerful in its own ways. And the local mechanisms for payment for ecosystem services through matching funds was started in 2008. I'll talk more about that program in a bit. And the Biodiversity Heritage Fund was started in 2010. So these are the 4 main programs of the Comisión Nacional Forestal, the National Forestry Commission. They are national scale programs. They have had huge impacts on forest communities and forested areas in Mexico. They have covered huge areas of land in Mexico and enrolled many, thousands, millions of participants. I don't have the number, but it has been a hugely impactful effort on the part of the Mexican government. So just to go, I'm going to be fairly black and white in my presentation since it's very short, but the basic theory of economic theory of payment for ecosystem services is that if you pay selfish, rational actors to conserve and you pay just a little bit above the opportunity cost of what they could be gaining by other uses of their land, that they will conserve. That's the basic theory. And that was really, I sat in enough of these presentations in the early days, and some of you in the audience perhaps can comment on this as well. That was how it was presented, was that it was that basic of these mechanisms you pay, people will conserve, you pay just enough and they will conserve. And if you can understand the science just right, and if you get past the post-normal science of understanding that that's not always the right way to do things, right? Actually, there's other ways of thinking about and working in the world. If you get the science just right of measuring the impact of production of ecosystem services and the economics just right of measuring just the opportunity cost, then everything will work. And all of a sudden, markets will form. And that was how it was presented. That was how it was received by policymakers, was that if you could do that, that markets would form. And that was how it was presented. And there still is very much this perception that if we could just get the theory right, if people would just do it right, if policymakers could understand the complexities and implement the complexities of this beautiful theory, that we would have perfect payment for ecosystem services. This is a publication from 2018 that stated as much. And I think that that's really harmful in a lot of ways, recognizing, I think as Dr. Duprat was talking about, that we need to understand that there are many different ways of understanding the world. There are many different constraints. There are many different theories about how the world should and could work, and people have their own motives for participating in these programs and in implementing them as well. So I'm going to be taking you through some of the tensions that I can see between this beautiful economic theory, which is indeed beautiful, and what I call applied theory. So that is the difference between the logic of the economic theory and really how people have understood these programs, their motives for implementing them, their theory behind why they should work and how. And I think that these tensions have been persistent since 2003. I can see that really since that they have been persistent tensions, and they have influenced how policy has been implemented, how it's been received by the people who are participating, how it's been understood since the early beginnings of this program, and it continues today. So the economic theory would have it that the basic logic of providing incentives is that you provide rational, selfish actors with payments, again, just above the opportunity cost, and they will stop degrading. They will choose to conserve versus other degrading, potentially economically beneficial, but hopefully not as beneficial activities. And again, I'm painting this in a very black and white scenario. This is not, I'm not stating that any one person, policymaker or policymaking body holds these views entirely, but just to make it clear what the differences are. So the applied theory, I think, in Mexico that has really challenged this notion is that that these payments can be a reconocimiento, a recognition of stewardship, of good stewardship, de buenas prácticas de manejo, no? That people are, the communities that own this forest land have been managing it well, but that they may also need further funding to manage it better, to implement fire brigades, to do more patrols for pests and diseases, to manage it in a way that will conserve in a better way. And so the payments can also be to cover incremental transaction costs of conserving more and conserving better. There's also, of course, an incredible tension between the economic theory about the goals, environmental goals and social goals. And a lot of the theoreticians on the, I'm just going to call it the economic side, state that if you have insert any social goals into payment for ecosystem services, that you will diminish the environmental impact. It necessarily weakens the kind of environmental impact you will have. And it's also that really you need to be forming markets as well in order to be able to do this. But on the other side, the applied theory, we see that there really is a strong focus on the fact that if you include social criteria in your targeting and how you're understanding who should be receiving these payments, that you can guarantee an equitable distribution of the benefits. And it can also even rectify social and structural inequalities that have been perpetrated over time. In a study that we conducted in 2014, and all of the work that I'm presenting today, of course, is entirely collaborative. I will claim some of it, but not all of it. So a large group of people and I got together and we conducted a study on how targeting had changed over time. And you can see, again, text is probably too small to read, but what you can see is that over time in the Mexican programs, and this is looking specifically at the Payment for Hydrological Services program, that increasing, that the Comisión Nacional Forestal increasingly included both greater environmental targeting for environmental values as well as social values. And the result of this was actually, again, a large group of people and I got together and did this work at a national level. What we found as a result of that targeting, that there was actually significant deforestation avoided, 60% reduction in the total forest loss. There was significant heterogeneity, though, in how that happened. There was greater deforestation avoided where there was higher land rents. So that would be like agricultural lands or lands close to cities. But also that the, sorry, I'm trying to translate while I'm doing this. This is the hazard. But the problem is that if you do target towards specifically for environmental values, that you will reduce the participation of the poor. Except in Mexico, what we found is that where there's communal land ownership, that actually gets reversed. Is that if you do target for environmental values, you will be including more common properties. We also found that the Payment for Ecosystem Services program had reached the poor. So the people who were receiving the program as opposed to in comparison to those who had not, or who were rechazado, who were rejected from the program, were more poor, if you want to just put it bluntly, than those who participated. We also found that there were small social or economic benefits to participation, Everyone, including the people who had been rejected from the program and those who had been included, were rising in income levels, there wasn't a significant difference. But there was some differentiation. There was significantly more income increase in very poor households. So I think that what that shows really is that both in terms of how policy has been influenced by these different applied theories versus the economic theories and the combinations of the two, has led to both environmental impacts, positive environmental impacts, and also positive social impacts. And that really that it is possible, right? And it's also necessary to combine the two. One other definite tension in these programs, though, too, and in the economic theory versus the applied theory, is that, that, again, according to the economic theory, markets are, or public policy based on markets or market-based policy is going to be more efficient and effective. And that's sacrosanct. They will be more efficient. But on the applied side, what we really see, and there is a strong discourse around this, is that while markets can be a potential source of funding, they're also very, very difficult to form, and they're very volatile. And so what we have seen over time, and I think we're going to be hearing from Kelly Jones along with Robert Manson later on about the persistence of some of these local mechanisms, is that there have not been that many markets per se for payment for ecosystem services formed in Mexico. I think with the exception of carbon, which is now taking off enormously. Those that have been formed are a hybrid, and I will talk about that in a second. And they are incredibly volatile. When they do form, they can disappear rapidly as well. And so then again, on the economic side, if you involve the state then, in these programs and that's state-led, you will see a decrease in the efficiency and effectiveness and the sustainability of payment for ecosystem services. But on the other side, the applied theory, you have people very strongly saying, especially in Mexico where you have a strong centralized state, that in order to form markets, you actually need the state. In order to provide incentives, regulatory incentives, the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure to do so. And also that ecosystem services, particularly water in the Mexican law, is a human right. So if you put over to markets, you relinquish control of the state for water and the provision of water, that you're relinquishing the absolute right, human right to water provided by law by the Mexican government. So there's tensions there, right? Oh dear. There we go. So one way in which this was seen to be implemented in the Mexican programs was in the matching funds program for local mechanisms. And that was the idea, again, this is a graphic that can demonstrate it, but the idea was that the Mexican government, the National Forestry Commission, really did want to both adapt, tropicalizar, or adapt these programs and payment for ecosystem services to local conditions, and also to have markets form at the local level. And so they gave half of the funding that was necessary to support a payment for ecosystem services program for up to 5 years. The other half had to come from a user of the ecosystem service. And the idea, again, was to both form markets and to have these things be adopted and adapted at the local level, and then kind of forward relinquish control. But what we found, though, too, in a pretty wide-scale study, again, that involved many people who will be participating today, is really that is not possible. There are a lot of different functions of particularly hydrological services programs, but also biodiversity and carbon, where there are economies of scale that are really very difficult to replicate because of economies of scale. It's very difficult to replicate some of these functions at the local level. And that can be communication of the promotion of the program, dissemination, clarification of the objectives, developing collaborations. The financial management is incredibly complicated. And it can best be done at a centralized level. And the remote verification of environmental impacts really is a centralized service. And then also there is trust in the Mexican centralized state where there may not be trust in local levels. There's also really strong roles to be played by intermediaries, whether that is nonprofit organizations or state level governments or municipal governments. And these intermediaries play incredibly important roles as well that really would be difficult to replicate in a market-based system unless, as in the case of carbon, there are huge gains, economic gains to be had. And so those include forming the contracts or the institutional arrangements to provide technical assistance and also to monitor the results. All right. So I just want to thank the funders of this work. There were many, and my collaborators. I'll show you in a second some of the people that I've worked with on this work, but also many of the communities that we worked with. They were so incredibly welcoming and were so willing to give of their time. So it's primarily thanks to them that this is coming to you now. So thank you. That's my email address and some publications. You can just start seeing some of the names of the people that have been involved in this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this big overview of PS in Mexico. I think it's a very synthetic way. I know that there is a lot of work behind all of you've presented today. So now I will present Santiago Izquierdo. He will talk about a systemic review of PS literature in Mexico, research priorities, and program outcomes. So Santiago is an ecological economist interested in the nexus between economic development, climate change, and biodiversity loss from an interdisciplinary perspective that integrates economics and ecology. So his publications and areas of study include economy theory and political economy of climate and biodiversity, economic-based environmental policies in tropical forests, collective management of natural resources in Latin America, and environmental justice. He has a doctorate and master from the University of Oxford in the UK and a bachelor's in economics from Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. He has a postdoctoral experience at ITAM and at the University of Quebec. And he's now currently an associate researcher at Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas here.
Okay. Thanks very much, Sophie, and thanks for that presentation. It was really interesting, Liz. I think my presentation really complements this look at how theory has been confronted with reality, and the presentation today deals more with what does the research community say about these programs. And this is a study that has been taking some time in the making, and I really want to thank Andrea, who's here, and Jimena, who have led the systematic review part, which we know is very time consuming and potentially really boring, but it yields really interesting results. So I'll present what we know about PS from the research community perspective over the last 20 years. Okay, so very quickly, I'll go to the methods, key results, and what are some key takeaways and next steps. So what did we do, or what did Andrea and Jimena do, is compile a bunch of publications from different databases and discussions from when this started a couple of years ago. And with Maria Perevchukova, who is here, we really wanted to take into account publications that are also in Spanish, and we'll explain why this matter, that are not always not always appear in international web searches. So we find with Scopus, Cielo, Redalic, and the CONACYT indexed journals, more than 1,000 publications with different keywords. And then we started to filter duplicates, things that didn't really focus on PS, and things that really didn't really focus on PS in Mexico. And in the end, we have 137 publications that deal specifically with PS in Mexico. We developed content analysis focused on what are some of the priorities of research, what are some of the methods used to assess PS in Mexico, and what do these researchers say about impact or outcomes. The process, as we know, is very time-consuming, very thorough. It's coding everything independently and then merging together, which takes a lot of time. So directly to results, what do we see? Rising interest in terms of numbers of publications per year until 2018. Since then, a sharp decline, and I think this 2022 is a bit misleading. We finalized the review on October 2022, so we might pick up a few more, but there seems to be a pattern of less interest on PS. So what does it have to do with does it have to do with reduced implementation because of reduced funding? Is it saturation that we already know everything about PS and we shouldn't really study it more? Or are there research incentives to move away from PS and to something else? This is a question that maybe you could provide answers to. Next, okay, so where is this research being published? So mostly in international outlets. These are the top journals, but there's 2 journals in Spanish here at the very top. These are the studies with the most number of citations, and you'll find some common names here. 71% in English, 29% in Spanish. So it seems that we have this kind of north-south divide at first glance. However, if we look at authorship, 55% of authors in Mexico, followed by the US, and then Spain. These are the most prolific, let's say, institutions: UNAM, Colmex, Cinecol, ICTA, Colpos, and many of these authors are participating in this event, so that's wonderful. And importantly, when we look at publications from first authors within a Mexican institution, it's half and half. No? So there is, it really contrasts with this image. No? When we look at who is publishing, a lot of publications within Mexico, so there's interest on studying pests within Mexico too, and also in Spanish. This is a cloud of the most common names in terms of first authors, and it's also nice to see these names here. Okay, so the question will pass now to what, where, who, and how. No? How are these things taking place? So firstly, what? Most publications focus on the national schemes, as we know, as the largest in terms of surface, but a very increased interest in local matching funds since at least 2015. These are the themes that have been studied, and we developed this, let's say, approach as a form of themes that are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. So anything can be situated within these themes. It's either design or evolution, participation, effectiveness on environmental terms, effectiveness on social terms, and policy recommendations. So it's quite balanced. But when we look at what happened in the first 10 years of publications to the last 10 years of publications, very important shift in terms of understanding the design process and evolution and policy recommendation. So I think that's an intriguing aspect. Potentially has to do with the evolution of the program itself and changes in implementation and design. No? So where is this research taking place? Mostly in the southeast, Veracruz, the state with the most number of publications, followed by Chiapas, Oaxaca. Now, when we look at implementation, what are the states with the most number of contracts? And these are, total number of PS contracts, including the national, subnational, and the local. It's the same name, no? But this is an analysis that was conducted by Andrea, which is super interesting, and it's which regions are over or under studied. This means research relative to implementation. So the image on the left, you'll see the number of studies per 100 contracts. So we have these overstudied states, and by far, Ciudad de Mexico is the most overstudied, let's say, because it has more studies per 100 contracts, and it has to do with having little contracts but a lot of research. Then Veracruz, Jalisco, and this is the other side, like states with no research. So we have 11 states where there are no peer-reviewed publications, and these are the names. So 0 studies in 11 states, despite this being 28% of all states. This probably may have to do with violence. This may have to do with networks of research. But it's a major gap in our knowledge, not knowing what happened in 28% of areas with PS. How is research studying the programs? Mostly through original work, mainly empirical work, focusing on programs that exist, and a part of it with experimental or hypothetical tests, like seeking how would a program look like if it were implemented. The main discipline, and we kind of compiled on disciplinary approaches. Social sciences would include any type of social sciences, but not the more critical social sciences, and not include environmental economics, which is a big part of publications too, and a small part of natural sciences that focus more on biological, ecological outcomes without necessarily engaging with the social systems. Type of methods, quite balanced, mix of quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods. So this is an interesting one too. What is the position towards PS reflected by researchers? So are they somewhat critical of the programs, openly critical, or not at all critical and more descriptive? And we find variations between authors main in Mexican institutions and authors main not in Mexican institutions. We conducted some tests to see the distributions, and they differ statistically. So it seems that authors from Mexican institutions adopt a more descriptive or less critical approach. I know this can be perceived as problematic, but this may have to do with the interest in also engaging in policy and what compromises that might entail. This is a running hypothesis. So looking at effects, what the publications say about outcomes or impacts. From these 130 publications, 55 provide some sort of evidence on impact or outcomes. And from here, we haven't finalized the review. So I'll present results from 31 reviewed publications that focus half only on social outcomes or impact, 25 only on environmental impact, and 22 that focus on both at the same time. So these research documents mostly positive environmental outcomes or impacts, using mostly forest coverage change as the metric. There are some few studies that have looked at direct ecosystem service indicators, but they're small compared to the forest change one, and mostly quantitative. So 60% are impact evaluation at the national, subnational, local scales. When we look at the social aspects, including institutions, economics, culture, all these other more social categories, much more mixed outcomes, and an important emphasis on looking at equity. So what is the distribution of program access, the distribution of revenues and benefit sharing and these practices. It's much more diverse in terms of methods, so a mix of quantitative and qualitative, and many other categories that are studied, which are not necessarily easy to put in the same category. So not easy to standardize or develop commensuration. So key takeaways and next steps. A lot of studies, and this resonates with what Jerome presented at the beginning. Mexico is one of the largest programs, and it's also one of the most studied. But there seems to be a reduced interest. What is going on in the research community? Not sure. The Mexican program is studied within Mexico, and the next step that we're taking is how, if any, are there differences between scholars from within Mexico and scholars outside Mexico, taking into account that being in an institution not in Mexico doesn't necessarily neglect you from participating in policymaking, as the case of Liz, no? But it contrasts with other studies that have shown a very clear north-south divide in terms of research knowledge production. Very uneven geographical coverage. So the southeast is very studied, center and north largely unknown. So how this is performing in the center and north, we don't really know. We could study this through secondary data, but there's no primary data whatsoever, at least in peer-reviewed scientific publications. We might have theses and other studies. What about outcomes and effects? It seems quite encouraging that mostly positive environmental outcomes, but mixed social outcomes. So can we understand PS as a win settle, where environmental is positive, other social aspects not necessarily or are mixed? Open question 2, and with that I conclude. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Santiago. Very nice work. There are quite an interesting results. Okay, so now I will present Andrea Alatorre. She will talk about the role of PS within the broader policy landscape. And well, Andrea, she's a biologist from this national university, UNAM. He also holds the degree of Master Science in Conservation Science from Imperial College London, in London, and the Master of Environmental Management in Environmental Economics and Policy from Duke University. She is currently pursuing a joint doctoral degree in Ecological Economics and Development Studies at the University of Quebec and the University of Antwerp Institute of Development Policy, respectively. And now her goal is to contribute to multidisciplinary and participatory research that puts communities first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. It's really, truly an honor to be here at UNAM talking about the role of payments for ecosystem services within Mexico's broader policy landscape. So Mexico's national payments for ecosystem services, as we have heard, they have been described as this constellation of programs because there are many different types and they have been very widely implemented across the country throughout this time. As we have also heard, studies have shown them to be pretty effective at maintaining forest cover throughout the duration of the contracts at least, and to have moderately positively influenced things like household income and perceived well-being. However, when we zoom into any of the points here on the map, we will find that PES is not the only thing that is in place there and that may be leading to these outcomes. Ejidos and communities who represent 85% of beneficiaries use their lands and their forests in a variety of ways, some of which are imposed by the government through regulation, some of which are proposed by communities themselves. So attributing any particular outcome exclusively to PES may be missing the bigger picture of what else is going on in the land and what else PES could be leading to other than this avoided deforestation, for example. So in order to figure out how PES is interacting with the forces that are present on the ground, mainly conservation through different types of protected areas and productive forest use through timber authorizations, we carried out this study in 2018 in these 4 different regions of Mexico. So in this study, we found multiple examples of spatial interactions, that is, places where PES is coexisting within each community's territory with, for example, protected areas, like in the case of the monarch butterfly biosphere reserve, intrinsically linked here, and also being used to finance the certification of voluntary protected areas in the case of Calakmul, but also with timber management by overlapping with timber authorizations or a fabrication of timber products, and with all sorts of creative financing and management overlaps. But we also found another type of interaction where we couldn't see the coexistence in space, but we kept hearing about what the land had been used for prior to PES and what they planned to do afterwards. And we termed these temporal interaction effects. So if we zoom back out at the national level, these interactions become very evident, these spatial interactions, by looking at the overlap that exists between PES, timber authorizations, and protected surface at the municipality level. So what I'm plotting here are all the municipalities that have at least 100 hectares under either a timber management authorization, PES contracts, or are under formal protection in the years leading up to 2020. So this is a very striking overlap here, but it's also only a snapshot in time, and it doesn't tell us anything about the direction and the conditionality of these interactions. So which came first, and how do they influence each other? In other words, it doesn't show us the temporal interaction going on between PES and these and other types of land use. So that's what I'm now trying to figure out through my doctoral research, how this diagram has changed over time, and what are the reasons for these changes. So this means adding the temporal component to our study about interactions to figure out what happened before, and crucially, what happens after PES, what broader political or economic trends it may be driving or facilitating, how there is now timber where PES once was, or a voluntary protected area, or simply more PES piling on top of each other. My question is very basically, what is the role of PES? What does PES do to the landscape over time? So I'm going to present 4 different hypotheses, which are based on these previous observations, as well as discussions that are going on in the literature. So the role of PES could be that because of the restrictions that it places on traditional extractive or productive forest use, it ends up creating dependency, economic dependency on these programs. The second hypothesis is that because of the training or capacity building that is involved with participation in the program, and the fact that many communities start working with a forestry technician for the first time for PES, it could end up facilitating the transition towards a forest-based market economy. Third hypothesis is that either by changing attitudes towards protected area or by incentivizing desertification of voluntary protected areas with the objective of gaining access to more PES markets down the line, it could end up increasing the total formally protected surface. The fourth hypothesis is that, of course, what PES could be doing is to unleash more agriculture onto the landscape by relaxing credit constraints and through mechanisms such as leakage and non-permanence. Now, I want to be very clear here that these 4 hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they all exist in reality. We can all probably think of a place that fulfills at least part of this trajectory. And part of the challenge is figuring out what variables influence the likelihood of each of these types of outcomes. So in order to start addressing this question, I'm going to present here the results of some preliminary analysis. So what I'm going to be looking at here is the change in the percentage of each municipality's area that is dedicated to either PES, timber authorizations, is formally protected, or to agricultural production at the municipality level between 2010 and 2020. So does PES lead to more PES? Well, here we can see if you simply plot PES in 2010 and PES in 2020, there is a positive relationship here. So more PES in the past, more PES in the future. With regards to timber, so here what I'm plotting, again, this is the percentage change for timber and for PES as a percentage of each municipality's surface. So each of the points on the graph is a municipality. So first of all, we can see that over the past 10 years, timber production has been increasing at the national level, and most of this increase is located in areas where PES is also increasing. With regards to protected areas, well, here we can see, first of all, that protected surface never decreases. Once a protected area is established, it pretty much stays there. And most of this increase over the past 10 years is attributed to these voluntary protected areas that Seminario has been certifying over the past decade or so. There isn't really a strong relationship here with PES, at least that we can see, at a first glance. With regards to agriculture, so again, here we can see that overall at the national level, over the past 10 years, the percentage of the municipalities' areas that is dedicated to agriculture has been decreasing, and most of this decrease is located in areas where PES is also increasing. But of course, we know that these relationships could be due to any number of external factors, and that's what I'm trying to account for in this next step. So again, this analysis is ongoing, it's very preliminary, but I'm trying to bring in here 17 independent variables, including all of the ones that I showed on the previous maps, as well as agricultural production, animal products, bee products, and population change to account for migration and other demographical dynamics to really kind of disentangle this effect of PES. So here I'm not showing the full results, only the effect of PES and of the past state of each of my dependent variables. So for PES, here we can see that it's almost a one-to-one relationship, right? And it's highly significant between PES in 2010 and PES in 2020, accounting, for all of the other variables that are changing at the same time. With regards to timber, this is a very interesting finding. We see that PES is highly positively and strongly significantly correlated to future timber authorizations. So actually, what I found very interesting is that having had a history of timber authorizations in the past is not significantly correlated to future timber authorizations. So PES is playing a stronger role in driving these future timber authorizations than past timber authorizations, at least in this model. Now, with regards to protected hectares, we can see that PES is positive and highly significantly correlated with an increase in protected surface, even though the effect size is quite small. And then with regards to agriculture, here again, interestingly, we can see that PES is not playing a significant role in this decrease that we have been observing in agricultural percentage of area dedicated to agricultural production. The sign is negative, but this is not a significant relationship. So in summary, we find that PES may be perpetuating itself. This could be pretty obvious through things like contract renewal or neighbor effects that may be in place within each municipality. And it also seems to be driving the timber industry and the certification of voluntary protected areas to a lesser extent. It's important to note that, of course, both of these effects or all three of these effects are very much by design. PES is designed to be renewed. It's designed to overlap with protected areas. And lately, there has been a push towards this investment of PES funds directly into so-called sustainable productive activities, such as timber authorizations. What is not by design, of course, is the fact that it doesn't seem to be doing much at all about agricultural production, when we could interpret the overall goal of PES as contributing to halting the agricultural frontier. Of course, this requires further analysis. But what these data don't tell us, first of all, is there causality behind these transitions? So is it a coincidence that one is happening after the other, or is this a conscious decision to transition from PES into one of these other types of land use? And if it is this conscious decision that I say, who is making this decision? Who actually has the autonomy or the capacity to make these choices? And what is the menu of real available options that they can choose from? Finally, of course, who wins and who loses from these transitions? Because it's very tempting to simply say, a successful transition away from PES would lead to more protected areas or would lead to productive forest use. But what is success is something that we constantly need to be questioning ourselves about. Success for whom? And these type of questions are the ones that I'm going to be exploring through in-depth case study research at a very near future. So with that, I say thank you. Thank you so much for joining me here, for all my collaborators, of course, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrea, to bring to the table that we have many other programs and policies at the same landscape, and they all coexist, and that's not an easy thing to deal and to design and to plan the territory with all those programs. So I think it's a very interesting point of discussion. Just a reminder that you can put your questions. Los que están en YouTube pueden hacer las preguntas y se las haremos llegar a los ponentes. Also, the ones that are in Zoom platform, they can also put your questions, and Santiago will take care of them, of the questions. Okay, so now, well, I will introduce Kelly Jones. So we just a minute to see Kelly, because she's virtually connected. So Kelly, she will present PES emergence and persistence in Mexico. She's an associate professor in the Department of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources at Colorado State University. She's trained as an environmental economist. She applied social science theory and methods to understand the interaction and feedbacks between people and nature. Her main area of interest is how formal and informal institutions shape human behaviors towards nature. This includes studying the role of economic incentive, land tenure, collective action, and public policy in changing conservation and socioeconomic outcomes. So thank you, Kelly, for being here remotely, but it doesn't feel like you are remotely connected. Go ahead.
All right, thank you, Sophie, for the introduction, and to Santiago for the invitation to be here. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'm happy to be presenting virtually on some recent work that I've done on the emergence and persistence of PES programs across Mexico. And this is with several colleagues, two of which are in the room today, Robert Manson and Sophia Villa, and also our colleague Sophia Lopez. And let me know if you can hear me fine, Sophie and Santiago. I hear a bit of feedback, but I'm going to keep going.
Yes, we can hear you. Okay.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to be focusing on the more local user finance version of PES across Mexico. And Liz introduced this program earlier. This is the Matching Funds PES program that started in 2008 by CONAFOR. And as we've already heard, this is a program where CONAFOR and local counterparts match funding to implement the PES program. So once the program is approved by CONAFOR, the local counterparts are the ones who get to determine the eligibility criteria for participation and the payment level. And these programs can be developed for different types of ecosystem services, including carbon and biodiversity. But the most common type that's been developed today is for watershed services. So this is a bit more of a user-financed or collective action funded PES program than the national government-funded PES program. And there are hypothesized to be some advantages to this more user-financed model, and that's that they can be more responsive to the local conditions, that they can help reduce transaction costs because the counterparts are actually in the area where the program is being implemented. And they, of course, help diversify the funding sources for ecosystem services. So in our study, we set out to answer two research questions. The first was, what factors are related to the emergence of these local user finance PES programs in Mexico? And because this is user finance, this is an interesting case study because we can actually see where collective action has taken place and these counterparts have come together to help co-fund the program. And then secondly, if a program emerges in the first place, do they persist over time? So are they still in operation by a certain date? So to do this analysis, we looked at the municipal level boundaries of Mexico. And as you can see in figure 1, we've mapped all those municipalities that developed one of these matching funds PES for water. We focused on that since it was the most common modality, between the dates of 2008 when the program started and 2019. And the ones in blue had a program, the ones in that brown never developed a program in that time frame. And then we brought together many different variables under biophysical, socioeconomic, and institutional categories that were hypothesized to be related to this question of emergence and persistence using various geospatial and government databases. Then we ran several regression models to understand what correlations existed between those factors and our two dependent variables of emergence and persistence. So because this is a short presentation, I'm just going to dive into kind of the key results that we found from our analysis and their implications and recommendations. So the first result I want to highlight comes from one of the biophysical factors. And what we found is that matching funds PES programs tend to emerge and persist in those municipalities with lower opportunity costs. And we know this from our data based on 3 variables that were correlated with these outcomes. We found that higher terrain ruggedness, which is a measure of kind of slope and unevenness, you can think about is not very suitable for agriculture. So that higher terrain ruggedness was more associated with emergence and persistence of these matching funds PES programs. We found that lower deforestation rates were associated with more emergence of a PES program. And we found that having more agricultural area extent in your municipality was associated with lower persistence of these matching funds programs if it emerged in the first place. So the implication of this is that these matching funds programs may be having less additionality because they tend to be located in municipalities that have lower opportunity costs. So one recommendation is to use more local contextual information on willingness to participate in PES contracts to better design contracts that work in those settings. So accounting for multiple motivations and barriers, not just financial motivations as we've heard about today, but really considering the social context and what's going to work to expand this program to other areas. The second result I want to highlight is that we found that these matching fund PS programs tend to persist more in municipalities where watershed services are impaired. So after a program emerges, the ones that tend to keep going over time are the ones that tended to have lower water quality and more reports of flood incidences. So poor hydrological conditions were associated with that program continuing over time. So the implication of this is that these matching funds PS programs do seem to stay established in the areas where they're going to have the most effect on watershed services. So potentially having a really, beneficial outcome to the environment. A recommendation based on this correlation is that the program could invest more in monitoring and reporting of these watershed conditions to encourage more program development and persistence in other municipalities. A third result I want to highlight comes from the variables under the socioeconomic factors or category. And that is that we found that these matching funds PS programs tend to emerge in municipalities with more ability to pay. And this is based on our data of two variables specifically. We found that the variable higher GDP per capita in municipality was associated with more emergence of PS programs. And we found that lower poverty in a municipality was associated with more emergence of a program. And this makes sense, right? Based on the matching funds model that you have to have counterparts in the municipality that can provide 50% of the funding. So ability to pay is important. But an implication of this is that these matching funds programs are probably not fairly distributed across municipalities in Mexico that could benefit from them in terms of ecosystem service provision. So a recommendation we made is to explore using differentiated matching amounts based on municipality need on the condition that there's a long-term financing scheme in place, because of course PS is premised on the idea that the users have to be able to pay for some sustainable amount of time for the program to work and provide the ecosystem services. A fourth result I want to highlight comes from the category of institutional factors. We found that matching funds PS programs tend to emerge and persist in areas that have more institutional capacity and awareness before the program begins. And we know this from our data because there were two variables that were correlated with this emergence and persistent outcome. We found that having the national PES program by 2008 or having the funds, watersheds, and cities program in the municipality by 2008 were both associated with having one of these matching funds PS programs emerge and increase the likelihood that that matching funds PS program persisted over time. So the implication of this is that these matching funds programs do require baseline levels of capacity and awareness at the municipality level in order to form, in order to be successful. So the recommendation here is for the program to work closely with these complementary programs like the Watersheds and Cities program, and or encourage the development of similar programs across Mexico where they do not exist. And the last result I want to highlight also comes from the category of institutional factors. We found that the local counterpart, the type of local counterpart, influenced the persistence of matching fund PS programs. So what we found specifically in our regression analysis is that the variables of whether or not the counterpart was a non-government organization or the counterpart was a water utility at the local level increased the likelihood that if a PS program emerged, it was going to persist over time. Now, we had three other counterparts in the analysis. We had municipal government actors, state government actors, and we had private sector actors as counterparts. Those were not statistically significant. So what we're not saying that having those actors decrease persistence, but we are saying that having an NGO or water utility involved in the matching fund program increased the likelihood that the program had some longevity. The implication of this is that these matching funds PS programs do better over time if non-state counterparts are involved. And the recommendation then would be for the program to encourage more non-state actor involvement either alongside state actors or by themselves. And just to expand on why we think this might be the case, under the figure there, we think that non-state actors might bring diverse funding sources, as we see in this water utility bill from Coatepec. They might bring more trust to the program, and they might bring more continuity to these programs over time. So just to wrap up, some final thoughts. For more of these local kind of collective action funded PS programs to emerge and persist in Mexico, we suggest the following. To really think about designing these contracts for the local context. So they both need to meet the local opportunity costs, but also address other motivators and barriers for participation, as we've heard from some of the other speakers. We need to use information on ecosystem service conditions, for example, those hydrological indicators, to really motivate local investments in ecosystem service protection. We need to identify diverse funding sources at the local level, potentially through involvement of those non-state actors like water utilities and NGOs, and consider using different matching amounts for municipalities based on ability to pay. And then lastly, we need to think about investing in local organizational capacity and awareness to encourage new user finance development in places that don't currently exist. So this analysis and the results are presented are based on a paper that came out earlier this year in Water Resources and Economics. Check it out if you want to get more information. And if you can't access it yourself, feel free to send me an email. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kelly. As always, very clear and precise on what you are wanted to transmit to the audience. So thanks a lot for that. So now we can open for questions. We have some minutes, not too many, but 5 minutes. So please here, if someone wants to make a question, just can put a hands up. Just a minute. The mic is coming. He's on his way. You tell me if you have any questions, Este or someone. Robert?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the underrepresentativeness of the northern part of the country being studied and things like that. And I wanted to just mention kind of an observation that I've had is that kind of these models, these programs are based on a model, a hydrological model of dominating surface flow. So, and the vegetation cover, changing the vegetation cover will affect the surface flow and the quantity and quality of water. And as you go further and further north, you get a situation where it's the groundwater that's the real issue, and the overexploitation of the groundwater. And really, what you do on the surface, as long as you don't control your overexploitation of the groundwater, you're not really dealing with the main issue. And so I just wanted to get your reflections on that and see what you think.
Okay. Is there any other question? No? Okay, so you want to answer that one? And I have also other questions.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that would explain like research more focused on hydrological services, hydrological service provision, significant conducted at INECOL and other institutions. But then a lot of studies focus more on like forest change and forest cover change. So there could be scope for that, considering that's 28% of all programs, but they're not studied. No? So, and I'm guessing, and we could do that analysis too, like which particular categories of programs are being implemented in those regions, and to see whether it's feasible to just do like secondary work. But it's interesting and like intriguing not to see any studies whatsoever, even those that could be done remotely, at the local level. So, but yeah, that's a good point on water.
So I have a couple of questions probably for the table. So I was wondering, hearing all the presentations, that talking about the tensions, about the theory and the empirical or the application of those programs. So we have also, how is the way to deal with that? We need to do more transdisciplinary analysis, taking into account then different perspectives from the municipality as we were looking at or so? Or is it more in terms of the design of the program that we need to think in other kind of aspects? And that's bring me to your presentation, Andrea, when if we are thinking in many programs, not only PES, all the pictures can change, right? So you can have some places where the coexistence of many programs, and not only environmental ones, also social programs, are into the landscape and they are interacting. So we need to plan differently all the incentives we are giving to people. And also in terms of the matching funds for Kelly. So it seems that we need a pre-existing context where local mechanism can be operated. But at the same time, probably all those conditions would only be in very specific watersheds or municipalities. So how is the potential? What is the potential of those local matching programs at a national scale? Or is it possible to expand them? Those conditions, do you think that could exist in many other municipalities or not? And that brings to the results that Santiago was bringing to the table, that, okay, we are studying PES in Oaxaca, Chiapas, the Ciudad de Mexico. Is that because we can see pre-existing conditions where the PES can work more, because there are more institutional conditions where those things have been happening? And that is also related to funding for scientific research. So I think it's a big question with many small questions. So please, I don't know who wants to start answering. Elizabeth?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'll keep it short too, because I know we have short on time. Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, Sophie, when you asked how do we deal with the tensions, I assume you mean academics. Yeah, okay. So I think there's a couple of different answers to that. And I'm going to go back to Dr. Dupra's talk as well, to think about the ways in which we as academics can not only conduct research, but also communicate that research and interact with people, both policymakers and participants in these programs. I think that it is incredibly important to recognize that as much as science plays a part, and as much as our theory about the ways that these programs should, or any program can and should work, is only one incredibly small part of how decisions are made about how policy is designed and implemented. And it is non-visible probably to the participants themselves. So I think that it is, I think Dr. Duprat talked about getting in the room with policymakers and talking to them, finding out how the data that we've generated, the results that we have, the implications of those results, what's important to them, what is vital, what is applicable, what is the applicable theory, how they're understanding the program and these programs and what they are supposed to do and how, and to have conversations on their level and understand that we are only providing one little piece. So I guess that would be one of my answers. The only other thing I would say about that too is that it is really important to understand that people have theories. They are theoreticians. Communities are theoreticians. Individual participants are theoreticians. Policymakers are theoreticians. And so understanding their theory of how these programs should work, what they're intended to do, is incredibly important for how to understand the ways in which these programs will actually be implemented and designed, and the impact that they will have. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I would jump on that, and just add that it's also about looking at the unintended consequences, no? Because I think this is what I'm trying to look at with this data that I'm analyzing, is that PES is really designed to maintain forest cover. It has very specific goals, but it's doing a whole lot of other things at the local level, and this is repeated over and over and again, and just kind of recognizing that even if we are which is obviously an open question, even if we are transitioning away from PES, whether it is because of fundings that are being reduced, whether it's because of research interest that is being directed elsewhere, it doesn't mean that the effects are gonna go away. It's already huge. It's a huge program. It's been going on since 2003. It's been covering, so many different areas and influencing the landscape in so many different ways. And I would call for a more situated or kind of acknowledging how these flows in PS research and also flows in PS practice are embedded within broader economic and policy trends, and to be aware of that. What else is happening after PES is in place. What is the future of PES? Yeah.
Probably do you want to jump?
Just to add on the question on these like pre-existing conditions for research, I already see like a soft product like of this research that could be called the persistence and emergence of best research. Like, what is driving research in this context? I'm guessing like some states like Chiapas in Oaxaca, it's the collective tenure and understanding these different dimensions, the role of indigenous communities in these things that makes it like sets it apart from other large-scale programs like Costa Rica, for example. So I'm guessing that's one driver. Pre-existing institutions that can conduct that research and that have funding, conditions of safety, these are other things. So it's a very fascinating issue, and it's something that we've just been scratching the surface. Like, what is driving research and what is driving like the persistence of this research too. So that's a topic that I'm very much looking forward to studying in the future. Yeah.
Okay, Kelly, and after that we have a couple of questions too. Yes.
Yeah, I'll just quickly chime in as well. I think, part of you asked the question about the organizational capacity or the role of other programs. I mean, I think that's not unique to PES. We see that in a lot of conservation programs, from community-based conservation, and also we also see it with who's participating in PES, with more, ejidos with higher capacity are the ones more likely to participate. So I think it's just recognizing there are preconditions for this tool to be used. And it's important to understand what those preconditions are, the institutional, as well as, having the right ecosystem service mix, users that can pay. And it's not going to be the appropriate tool for everywhere. And I think that's part of, one of the big research questions is, where is it appropriate and where can it be a complement to other programs and where can other programs complement it? And I think, Andrea, your research is going to be really interesting to see those complements and how that changes over time. But I think that's really these policy mixes, which I think are really important to explore as we move forward studying PES. So, thanks.
Do we have another question? El micro, por favor. Yes, otherwise people in YouTube cannot listen to you.
Hi. There you go. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting panel. I'm no expert in PES, but so my question is a very basic one. Going back to Lisa's presentation with a basic definition of PES. Sorry. You say it goes back to paying above the cost of opportunity, right? So who and how is this cost of opportunity estimated? Because I think mainly the question about sustainability goes down to that, and also, for example, maybe some ejidos or agricultures might not have the same estimate of what the cost of opportunity is. So it might not be as interesting implementing this program as, I don't know, whoever is willing, for example, CONAFOR or whoever else is implementing the program. Does the question make sense? Yeah. Okay.
So I will just start by saying I'm not an economist, So I may pass this over to Kelly and Santiago. But I will say that the way that this has worked, so I'm sorry, I thought we were preaching to the converted here. Everyone knew what payment for ecosystem services was. So I'm sorry that didn't go more into the background. So the idea really is that, yes, if you get the payment just right, just paying just over the opportunity cost, then the program will be successful. So in a market, of course, that would be negotiated. So people would not accept payment unless it was, unless it was above what they could be gaining otherwise through other activities. But in a government program, we don't have that luxury necessarily. So the way that it worked, especially in the first phases of the Payment for Hydrological Services program, which was the first program to be implemented, was that a huge national study was done to estimate the average opportunity cost for all of Mexico based on corn production. And there was more sophistication than that, but that was the basics of it. And the payment was set. So one standard payment for all participants. And that has then varied over. So, and that was problematic for the reasons that you might imagine. That has varied over time. Payment rates have differentiated in some of the programs based on the quality of the ecosystem services produced, the rates of deforestation in that area, so the likelihood for additionality, and a number of other factors. But Santiago or Kelly, do you want to, true economist, would you like to add anything? Did I get it right?
Kelly? You want to go ahead?
Oh, no, I think you did a nice job, right? Just the idea that, what's the other alternative that farmer or landowner would be doing? And can we meet that with conservation payment? That was good.
Sí, ok. Aquí hay otra pregunta. Esteve, go.
Hola. Hi, everyone. Hola, todo el mundo. It's a question for Andrea. Andrea, if I understood correctly your work, can you switch off the mic in the room? Because I hear a lot of echo.
Ok, si pueden apagar este tantito. Just
Perdonad, disculpadme. So the question for Andrea was that if I understood correctly, you were suggesting that agricultural the hectares dedicated to agriculture were being reduced, but I didn't understand if this was only in municipalities and communities involved in PS, or this was for the whole Mexican territory. Whether you were hinting at some kind of rural transition where agriculture is being abandoned, something that has happened a lot in Spain over the last 40 years, or you were just talking about specific PES sites? Thank you.
Thanks, Esteve. Yeah, no, it's overall, so it's not just for PES municipalities, it's for at the national level. I think a lot of it may be driven by this moving away from agriculture, this abandonment of agriculture, but definitely not all of it. And I think one thing is important to think about, and I plan to do some further analysis of this, is that the fact that the number of hectares of agricultural production have been reducing could also just be linked to mechanization, or increased efficiency and other types of agricultural methods, because I'm not here. I could also rerun the analysis not for hectares but for actual output, right? So volume or some other measure of agricultural output, and we may see a different trend there. And if we do, then it means that this change is more driven by intensification than by abandonment. So at this moment, I can't tell you which one is more likely, but I think probably both are playing a role here.
Thank you so much.
There is one last question. Por favor, el micrófono para, si nos puede decir su nombre. ¿Tienes el micrófono? En lo que va bajando el micrófono, hay dos comentarios en las redes por Carmen González. me interesa el trabajo de Andrea, ¿en dónde puedo leerlo? Entonces, pues, sí, correo, no sé. Le damos la palabra.
Yep, David Bidmore from University of Reading. I was interested in the earlier question about what this opportunity cost is, and you were saying that it's uniform over Mexico. It's not, because if it were uniform at one stage, then surely you can do an analysis as to whether the uniformity of the opportunity cost, what the people in the field were being paid compared to what they got in return, would reflect their interest in continuing with PES.
Yeah, that's how the program started. It was a uniform payment based on let's say an average assessment of opportunity costs for corn production, and it was around 300 pesos per hectare. So if the program is rolled out, then only those people who are interested, or it compensates their opportunity cost plus other motivations, individual or collective, were those interested in participating. So the payment was standardized, but then participation was not. And it really, what many studies have shown with the evolution of different tiers of payment, depending on the ecosystem or the type of program, there is a tendency for those people with lower opportunity costs to participate more than those with higher. And so there is an economic logic there, but then you need to add all the other collective dynamics, the identity of land and other aspects beyond the economic part of it, which also complement or might go against the logic of opportunity cost. So I think that's how it was rolled. It was a standardized program. When it landed, very uneven participation interest, in many ways reflecting that those variations in opportunity costs.
I will also say that it was very reflective of the budget they had. So that's when, there were political motivations for how much the payment was. There were other things that were happening, not only on the decisions of people to participate, but also on the policymaker side as well.
If this is not only a governmental program but also private, then surely you could raise the offer for those who have a greater opportunity cost, so that they then take up the program as well.
Exactly. That's mainly part of the local funding matching programs, what they want to have. No? More. Okay, so I think we're going to go for a break. Hay un comentario de Yudmila Morán, qué increíble reunión de ponentes. Y
This question in YouTube. Is there a network of PES researchers in Mexico? I think there is a lot to share and collaborate.
Yeah, mainly that's the idea, to keep going and to have a social network on PES researchers. Enthusiastic first, but at the moment, no. So thanks a lot. We're going to have 5-minute breaks to have a coffee and so on. Bye. Bye. Takes a time to switch.
I know. Oh my God. And sometimes, I woke up this morning and I could not speak Spanish. No podía hablar. No, I digo, okay.
Welcome back, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone, to this second panel. Which is dedicated to lessons learned from the field. So this will be a first panel on it, and after the lunch there will be a second one. So we have 4 speakers here and a guest to complement and comment, take questions, Pierre. So we're going to start by a talk from Sophie Avia. Sophie is currently investigator asociado at the Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas de UNAM. And a member of the board of directors of the National Coastal Resilience Laboratory. She received the National University Distinction for Young Academics in the area of research in economic and administrative sciences in 2012. And is a member of the Sistema Nacional de Investigadores Level 3. Dr. Avila has a PhD in Environmental Economics and Ecosystem Management from University of York of the United Kingdom and a Master in Integrated Management of Tropical Coastal Zones from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. Also from the UK. She's a biologist from the Faculty of Science at UNAM. Her line of research are sustainable diversification of the rural sector, resilience of socioecosystems, economic valuation, and environmental policies. She has several publications and has been in charge of research projects and thesis supervision. Thank you, Sophie.
Okay. So this presentation, the original title that you can see in the program is PES Permanence and Ecosystem Services in Copalita Watershed, located in Oaxaca. So I will talk about this case study, but actually I'm going to present some research that is in progress. And so you can see the co-author of this publication, of this work. And so we're gonna present the impact of these PES on deforestation and ecosystem services provisioning. And this is part of a larger project called Trajectories of Social Ecological Systems in Latin America Watershed. You can see all the papers, theses, products that we've been doing in this project that just ended this year or last year. So the webpage, you can see it's hosted in Colegio de Mexico. That project was tended to analyze trajectories and mainly based on different activities, coffee production, on tourism, social networks, analysis for hydrological ecosystem services, and also coffee production and so on. And we had, during this project, analyzed a lot of the ecosystem services within this watershed. So we did an analysis on projecting changes on these services related to climate change. And we also had the polygons of different policies within this location. So we decided to dive into this program because we believe that it is important for the watershed. I will explain that in a minute. And so that's why this presentation is about this case study. So firstly, I would like to highlight that Oaxaca is one of the highest states with the highest deforestation rate in Mexico, but at the same time, it has one of the main states with PES program running from 2003 to 2014. We had also this program, the PES federal program, as we were discussing this morning. We have the federal program and the matching fund. The federal program is representing 3.9% of the total state territory and 6.4% of the forest in that state. And the local matching fund represents 1.14 of the state territory and 1.84 of the state forest. In sum, we can see that forests enrolled in PS schemes are around 8% of the total forest of the state. So PS is important for that state. We can see the program in different places of this region, in the coastal area, Sierra Sur, also within close to the Oaxaca city, the Sierra Norte, and also in the Sierra Sur and Mixteca. So it's well represented along the state, and we also had a very important local matching PS program, particularly in Copalita watershed. That program stopped in like 3-4 years ago because of institutional issues within the arrangement. But at the end, it is a very important program for this state. So what we did is to evaluate the impacts of PS on changes in annual deforestation and provision of 2 hydrological services, water yield and sediment retention, for the years that you can see in the screen. And we evaluate the previous impacts when areas have been in the program for more than 1 year. So we were interested to see if the permanence of the programs for more than 1 year makes a difference in the outcomes in terms of deforestation decrease and in terms of hydrological services. All of that was done through a special temporal and counterfactual approach. So we had then polygons enrolled and polygons that were not enrolled in the program. That's what we call treated and controls. And we also had areas participating with 1 contract and areas participating for more than 1 contract. Okay, so as I was saying, this is the shape of Copalita complex. It's a complex of 3 watersheds actually. And but the Copalita region, it's very interesting because you have at the top temperate forest, then you have in the middle tropical forest where mainly shade coffee is grown, and then at the downstream of the watershed, like this, here you have touristic resorts and also other kind of activities like traditional agriculture activities. So you can see from those images that I'm showing here, these are the polygons that the ones that are in yellow, red, purple, and green, yes, are the polygons that are enrolled in more than one contract. The other one here is the enrolled areas and non-enrolled areas, and the shaped ones are the overlap between those 2 that were then taken out of this analysis. So what we did first is to decide which were those polygons that we were going to use for this analysis. We already had some of the analysis on ecosystem services that were done previously in class study on water yield and sediment retention. And then we did, we used logistic regressions models of different vegetation indices generated in Google Earth Engine for the years you can see all over here to see the deforestation rates. Then we use then the propensity score matching. That is a method that wants to see differences between pre-treatment before the program and after the program, and then you need to have similar conditions of the ones that are enrolled and not enrolled in terms of socioeconomic aspects, landscape, climatic variables. Okay, so some of the results that you can see here, first of all, is that the first result is that you can see differences when you analyze at a watershed scale. I'm sure that probably Robert is going to talk about that as well, is that there are differences between upstream and downstream generally when you are talking about deforestation or other ecosystem services. And here, so we can see the trends on deforestation, water yield, and sediment rotations within enrolled and non-enrolled lands. Well, the main message of this is that for deforestation, we can see differences in enrolled and non-enrolled polygons before and after. So we see there is a positive effect of the program within those polygons. Whereas in water yield, we couldn't see an evidence, significant evidence on the water yield increase after and before the program in enrolled and non-enrolled lands. And sediment retention also, we could see some positive effect of the program. Okay, so then this is some of the results of the matching and differences in different analysis. The first graph is for temperate forests. As I was saying, we can see some differences when we are talking about upstream or downstream. And so, but other, I mean, in general, we could see that deforestation rates were significantly high previous implementation of the program. We find that then that PS significantly reduced the rates of deforestation primarily in temperate forests, not as much in the lower part of the watershed. And also, we could see that the effect of the polygons that are more time within the programs were more positives compared with the other polygons. Okay, then that is the other result that we can see the difference on enrolled more than once and non-enrolled was what I was saying in the temperate and in the deciduous and evergreen forest. I have to say that we put together the more tropical and dry forest within the downstream. We didn't differentiate them, so probably that we can have some more discussion about that. But I was saying deforestation rates were significantly high previous implementation. We find that the PS significantly reduced deforestation during the implementation in temperate forests and not as much as in tropical and the other evergreen. Okay. We can come back on some of those results if I forget something later. Okay, so in terms of water yield, here water yield showed a decreasing trends from 89 and 2019, and that is due to changes on land use cover and climate change effects. So the results indicate a significant effect, negative effect of PS on annual water yields. We couldn't see that if we have a positive effect on PES in these water yields or in these ecosystem services. But water yield values were greater in treated areas granted with more than one contract, at least, compared to the control. So at least we could see some of the positive effects here. Okay, in terms of sediment retention, results indicated a decreasing trend in sediment retention due to changes in land use cover and climate change. So that was similar to the previous ecosystem services. And sediment retention values were greater in temperate forests compared to deciduous forest, showed the same positive effect due to the implementation of PES programs. So to wrap up all of these graphs and data, PES has a positive effect on the forest conservation and sediment retention, but a negative effect on water yield so far. So that's analysis that is taking place right now. So we haven't discussed it with our co-authors yet. Participating more than once in PS secures the permanence of conservation gains in terms of deforestation and sediment retention mainly. So in terms of the differences between the upper part of the watershed and downstream, Of course, we have the type of ecosystem probably influencing, but also we think that the context is influencing those results. I mean, we have more different activities within downstream, and also we could possibly see some crowding out effects. As we were listening this morning in this area, probably the program is not giving too much additionality in terms of conservation areas, and we can see some trade-offs between ecosystem services clearly, between water yield and sediment rotation, and also some effects of climate change effects. I think that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
Very much, Sophie, and I understand that this was your work, but also Pierre's work. So I didn't present you, Pierre, and let me do so ex post after the presentation. But Pierre is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas at UNAM here, and he's focusing on modeling the impact of land use changes, climate, and biophysical factors that affect socioeconomic system and ecosystem services. His master and doctorate focused on natural resource management at INECOL, and since 2007, his work has centered on the use of remote sensing tools to quantify ecosystem services, the modeling of spatio-temporal dimensions of socio-ecological system, and watershed management. Thank you to both of you. And our next speaker is Robert Manson. So while you're getting installed, I'm going to present you. So Dr. Manson obtained his doctorate in ecology from Rutgers University in the USA. He's a senior researcher at the Instituto de Ecologia INECOL, CONACYT Federal Center. He began his work in Mexico with a postdoctoral fellowship from the Natural Science Foundation. His studies focus on the quantification and evaluation of the hydrological environmental services of the forests of Mexico, the strengthening of the hydrological payment for ecosystem services program, and the study of the role of coffee agroforestry systems in maintaining the structure and functioning of the mountain cloud forest. Dr. Manson is the author of more than 110 articles published in national and international index journals, book chapters, and books focused on coffee agroforestry in the center of the state of Veracruz and the importance of environmental services for social and economic well-being in Mexico. He is a member of the Sistema Nacional de Investigadores Level 2. Thank you, Robert.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias. Thank you very much of the organizers of this event for the opportunity to present. It's been a real challenge putting this talk together just because we have so many different institutions, researchers, research topics. And what I tried to do is just synthesize some main messages without getting into too much details. And I also did Liz's approach of putting Spanish in. So if I start speaking Spanish, let me know. I'll shift. But to help people that are maybe it's not their first language. So this project that I'm going to present was financed by the NSF Dynamics of Natural Human Systems program. And it basically focused on looking at payments for hydrological services as a complex socio-ecological system. And that's very different from how these programs are typically managed and conceptualized, where you have a program, with incentives that creates more participation, that affects changes in cover, and then it changes the target ecosystem service. We all know that, well, we have a lot of other ecosystem services. So if you conserve for one service, well, you're conserving for a lot of other services. And that's going to have feedbacks in the whole system, in particular socioeconomic impacts that could change the trajectory of the development of the program in the future. So the project wanted to look at that in an integral way to try to calculate the net impacts of these payments in Mexico, using a case study in central Veracruz. And so our experimental design was to work with two watersheds in particular adjacent to each other. The one in pink is the Pisquiac watershed that provides water to Jalapa, the city of Jalapa, and the blue one is the Gavilanes watershed that provides water to the city of Coatepec. And they both have active programs that have since been converted into these the local matching funds programs. And within these watersheds, we chose 8 micro watersheds dominated by different land uses, where we did some long-term monitoring and a lot of sampling to look at the impacts of payments on hydrological services and other ecosystem services. And unfortunately, sorry, Sergio, we're not going to be able to present that. It's just a little bit too much detail. But I would be happy to talk more about that after. And we also did a lot of surveys and interviews within these watersheds with the communities and also with the downstream users in the cities. So some of the take-home messages. The first one is we observed very low or fairly low additionality and an indicator of program effectiveness. The payments, if we compared treatment and control plots using methods similar to those that were described by Sophie to control for differences in biophysical and socioeconomic characteristics between the parcels, basically slowed down deforestation but didn't stop it completely. And if we looked at the where the payments were being made, it turns out that they were concentrated mostly in areas of steep slopes and that are fairly isolated. So the additionality was fairly low. And then when we repeated this at a larger level, using difference in difference methods, and including some other watersheds to the north, for example, that provide water for the city of Tuxpan, and to the south, therefore Lux Tuslas, that provides water for the city of Coatzacoalcos. It turns out we got very similar patterns with an overall concentration of payments, about 56% in areas of medium to low deforestation risk. So the central message here is that, getting back a little bit to Liz's talk, payments are low. We're maybe providing some payments for good behavior to a lot of people, but we're not really maybe affecting the ecosystem services as much as we could. So another take-home message is that the impacts that we did observe in terms of socioeconomic impacts were more on the level of perceptions than in socioeconomic well-being. So when we compared the participants in the program and the non-participants receiving and not payments, there was a significant more of the people receiving payments reporting benefits, perceived benefits. But both groups reported the greatest perceived benefit was conservation of the forest, followed by increased trust and collaboration at the community level, and finally, and lastly, economic impacts. And when we looked at impacts in particular, starting off with non-material impacts, the program participants reported higher quality of life, both at the home and the community level. And in terms of material benefits, the only thing that we detected was for private landowners that were managing cattle. So very minimal impacts on material benefits. And then a study done by Sophie showed that only about 8% of total annual earnings came from the payment program. So it was very minimal, and it was being used mostly for household expenses, for healthcare, and for home improvement. So another interesting finding was, given the fact that our two programs adjacent to each other were very different in how they're managed and who's in charge, and where they get their financing from, things like that. We were able to detect that in the impacts that the programs were having on the local communities, the participants. And so we first, this is a thesis of Sophie again, Daniel Torres. He looked at sustainable livelihoods and the capitals associated with the sustainable livelihoods and compared those receiving payments and non-payments in both watersheds. And the blue, the darker blue, indicates significant impacts, positive impacts, and the black is marginal, maybe trends, and then the gray is no impact at all. So you can see in the Piscataquis watershed, there was a lot more impact in the different capitals than in the Gavilanes watershed. And this was also true when he did an analysis of social networks. Both watersheds, you can see how they're forming their contacts between key actors in the watersheds over time. That's increasing, but it increased faster in the Piscataquis, and there was a greater diversity of actors than in the Gavilanes. And we think that that's related to the presence of an NGO that was kind of the facilitator in the Piscataquis watershed. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Another take-home message is that we have to consider kind of what's the effect on downstream users and upstream providers of watershed services of the actual participation in the program and in their changes in their perceptions. And I wanted to illustrate that. So we're kind of thinking about feedbacks in two studies that were done. One was a discrete choice experiment with a large sample size in both Coatepec and Jalapa, where they would be presented with different possibilities, possible modifications or improvements in the program, and they would say whether or not they were interested in those based on the amount they're willing to pay. And so one thing we saw was that the local knowledge, for example, in Coatepec, there was more knowledge about where the water was coming from, and that seemed to be related to a higher willingness to pay. So it's just kind of the relationship between improved understanding of the hydrological, ecological system and the willingness to pay. And then also in Coatepec as well, where it's traditionally been coffee growing area, they're much more willing to pay for including coffee into the payment programs, and also they were willing to pay more than in Jalapa for including an NGO as an integral part of the program, because they don't have that actually. Right now it's just the local government is running the program. And interestingly, we saw that in both watersheds in both cities, the willingness to pay is far above, from 16 to 70% of what they're paying monthly for their water bill. It's much above what they're being charged. So there's this potential for getting at higher opportunity costs in areas that are going to be important for hydrological services, but it's not being taken advantage of. And then also we saw similar types of possible feedbacks, and we did some role play simulations where we invited the local actors in Coatepec and Jalapa to play a role that they're not accustomed to. So the water provider was a user or a person in charge of the program. And so through that exercise, we could see how that changed perceptions over time. It increased the knowledge, the willingness to pay, the understanding about other actors and willingness to listen to them, and also the capacity to negotiate collectively to bring about better outcomes for the larger community. All of that came out as a result of this role play, and so we think that that's really important, that projects looking at payment for ecosystem services need to look at these effects over time of participation directly in the program. And lastly, I want to emphasize Pierre here again. These were some studies that were done in parallel but independent of the project, but I think that they're important as a message for this symposium, and that's the lack of spatial targeting. And how that could impact, obviously, the impact of the program on hydrological services. So in the first study, Pierre basically ran invest models for hydrological services and carbon, and then compared the areas that are deemed important for those ecosystem services in the landscape to where CONAFOR is saying that you're eligible to make payments in those areas, or they're physically making payments, and there was almost no overlap. It was very low, like 10%. So that's an area of opportunity. And also, another study that Pierre did for his master's work, I think, is really important, showing a positive relationship between riparian corridors, water quality, and public health. Currently, riparian corridors are not eligible to receive payments. It's considered a federal zone. So when you get a water concession in Mexico, you're given a tract of land along the riparian corridor for 20 years. And we think that that's an area of opportunity as well. And actually, there's a project of the Mexican Fund for the Conservation of Nature called RIOS that's designed to attack that problem and try to make those areas eligible, because we think that you can have a much greater impact in a shorter time period, showing the downstream users the impacts of the benefits of the payment program by focusing on these areas, rather than looking at like longer term changes in water quantity, but shorter term changes in water quality as a way of really selling the program. So what can we conclude? Well, we saw positive effects, but they're pretty weak, both in terms of stopping the deforestation, adding to additionality, and also improving socioeconomic well-being. So the big challenge there are more resources. So the financing of these programs, how do we increase the budget, and also using these models for better targeting. So the good news is that there's a lot of willingness to pay, in these areas. But the challenge is having the opening by the decision makers that they're willing to modify these programs to address the concerns of the downstream users that are paying into the program, and also they're going to improve their performance over time. And in that sense, one thing that I think would be the consensus of all the people participating in the project, it's really urgent, better monitoring. I mean, that should be almost obligatory when you start these programs, that you do socioeconomic surveys, you do water sampling, so that over time you can see the impacts of these programs. It's amazing that I think in 2010, the law was changed, and you could dedicate up to, I think, a certain percentage of the local funding in the matching program for monitoring, and almost nobody is taking advantage of that. So that's a huge issue, because basically these are social contracts, and the users are paying into the program because they think that they're going to over time improve their water quantity and quality. And if we can't show that, then this whole thing could break down. So that's it. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this great presentation. I see so many parallels in what you've been presenting and what I was this morning. So really different parameters, spatial targeting, efficiency. So this is really, I think, the state-of-the-art questions that we need to address for PES development. So thank you very much. So Santiago, you've been presented in the last panel. So I'm just going to let you the floor for your presentation.
Okay, thanks. All right, so today I'll present results from what I call a long-term case study that I've been building with a series of colleagues in Selva Lacandona in Chiapas. It's a very region with very important specificities that for sure had played a role in how the program has developed there. And I'll try to emphasize what have we learned. Have conservation payments paid over time or not? Okay, so firstly, I'll describe how we have approached study these effects, key findings, and takeaways. So this, I think, resonates with Liz's presentation. So there are different ways to examine PES, and my research has involved both. The left-hand side is more, let's say, in environmental economics realm. It has to do with what is the role, if any, of PS in solving an externality. So what are some issues that you can focus on? Impact evaluation, effective design, and effective implementation. More, let's say, within economics from a partial equilibrium approach, where we, everything else constant, modify one thing. What is our outcome? And more broadly, more in the realm of ecological economics, is can PS solve a collective action dilemma? So what things are important to emphasize in this type of research? Role of economic incentives, rules of sanctions, questions of equity and justice, interactions between social ecological systems. So these programs are parachuted into very complex socio-ecological systems. How do these dynamics change? I see a lot of scope for doing both types of analysis, in some way complementary. Sometimes there can be incompatibilities, that's for sure, but I think my research has adopted a more like open stance to methodology, focus more on the questions rather than methods. Sometimes if the questions have to be addressed through impact evaluation, that's fine. So it really depends on what is your interest in research, at least in my case. And I hope that it's been productive over 15 years. Case study is a region in Selva Lacandona in Chiapas, and particularly what you see here highlighted in gray. It's a municipality called Marqués de Comillas. It's a region of very high biodiversity as part of the broader Selva Lacandona region. It's a tropical frontier. It was very recently settled, promoted by state policies. It was either militarize the border because it's completely bordered by Guatemala, or promote settlements. And government chose the latter. So these communities from across Mexico, and very heterogeneous communities, populated the region. Very high deforestation rates, triggered mostly by cattle ranching. And an important part is collective participation. So most contracts, I think all contracts take place at the communal level. But when we look at actual land ownership, it's a minority. And I'll explain what it means in terms of like collective action. So how I have approached this case study: firstly, volunteered with an NGO that's been part of my research and a collaborator ever since, Ecosistemas Mexicanos. Did my postgrad studies there, postdoc, and now at UNAM. Importantly, in terms of data collection, more than 1,000 surveys, hundreds of interviews, focus groups, workshops, participatory observation, geospatial data, any type of data that can be useful for answering different types of questions. And a very important part of it is continued engagement with the communities and with policymakers. So in this case, it's CONAFOR, from the Tuxtla Gutierrez regional office to the central offices. And we've published a lot of studies and popular science outlets, because that's an important aspect too, and a couple of running projects, and I'll present some of the results from these. So do payments pay off over time? Let's look at results from the more environmental economics aspect. So questions of compliance: are people complying with their contracts? Overall, yes. Compliance over 97%, and important interest in renewing their contracts. So they've been participating over 15 years now. So yes. Additionality: are these results additional relative to a baseline? And in this case, it turns out yes, highly additional, and also the effectiveness increases over time. So as people renew their contracts, and I think this resonates also with Sophie's work, the impact increases over time with years enrolled. So yes, quite additional. What about leakage, spillovers? Are these programs creating deforestation in other sites? We do have some evidence of this, and this has to do with a process that we call partial enrollment, where people, let's say they own 100 hectares, they might only choose 50 to enroll, and they comply, but they leave 50 outside, and they can do whatever they want. And we do see a very different pattern of deforestation in lands that people chose not to enroll. This has a lot to do with opportunity costs, and lands with low deforestation risk tend to be enrolled, but this is at the household level. So it really shows us the household dynamics playing there. So more or less. Permanence, what do we know? What happens if payments stop? We do have evidence that, so there's been rejected applications have to do with similar levels of interest, but reduced funding. So overall, more demand than supply, so more rejections. It is a voluntary withdrawal, and it has to do with payments have been constant at the 1,000 pesos per hectare since 2010, but everything else has increased dramatically, so it's not really compensating. So people might enroll, but they enroll less. So every iteration, 5% more, or even more. But we don't have any, and we don't have any studies on ecosystem service effects. So it's an opportunity to join the Selva Lacandona group. So I don't know, we don't know. What about improved design? Is there scope for improving the design? We do have a study with my colleagues Sima Jayachandran and Santiago Saavedra, and we tested what happens if we randomly allocate a group of people who wanted to participate in a program to different cohorts. One receives a baseline treatment, which is exactly similar to the CONAFOR program, and another treatment, or treatment B, which is full enrollment. So people either have to comply with they have to enroll everything or nothing. And we found that including this restriction reduces compliance, but it really increases avoided deforestation. So it has to do with reducing the possibility of this leakage. So these numbers are they are bound to change a bit as we finalize the analysis, which has happened actually today, but the direction is the same. So increases effectiveness, but reduces compliance. Overall, the effect is positive. So yes, design can be improved. What about our PS solving a collective action dilemma? What if are people able to sustain participation and locally adapt as the program evolves? So yes, we have a study called Local Responses to Design Changes, and it actually looks at how the program evolves and how people respond collectively to these changes. And so they are quite able to locally adapt and devise different institutions that resonate with these new rules. If they don't like the rules at all, they decide to withdraw. And if the program rules change and improve, then they enroll again. So it's a very dynamic process. It's not all or nothing. It's a dynamic process over time. So yes, people are able to sustain participation and adapt to the program. What about questions of equity and justice? We do find that the benefits, well, the distribution really varies by communities. We find a strong relation between individual land ownership and cash disbursals. And when it comes to communal lands or communally held lands in different types of ejidal parcels or uso común, it really depends on the communities. And communities distribute to each household, others to each ejidatario, others to groups of women, so it really depends. But what we found is this distribution replicates land tenure and other power relations. So some positive and some negative aspects here. What about natural resource management? What about the development consolidation of rules? So yes, there's been a process of this type of rule building and institutions for natural resource management, particularly associated with the control of fire, less so with other illegal activities that we know are associated with much broader processes beyond the community's ability. And conservation motivations, this is a study that is led by Este Corbera, who is the next presenter. And we've been looking at what are some of the motivations for participation. So we find that there is a high degree of intrinsic motivations among people who participate, and they are higher than extrinsic motivations associated with receiving a payment or others participating. But what we found is a very important aspect of self-selection. So within a community, it's only a minority of people who want to participate, and they feel very strongly about PS, but there's a much larger cohort within the community who does not participate, and there doesn't seem to be an interaction there. There doesn't seem to be a process of broader participation from the minority group to the majority group in the community. So more or less. So some takeaways, what is the experience in this region of Selva Lacandona? Very highly effective at reducing deforestation, unclear effects on ecosystem services. So this is, again, an invitation for the experts. Mixed social outcomes, because they replicate on very uneven land tenure and other power relations. Communities that are very evenly distributed, everything works fine. In others that are very unevenly distributed, it's really replicating what happened before. So it can be problematic. Oops. So, and then looking towards the future, there's a very real risk of losing these cumulative gains, particularly because of reduced funding. People get upset if they are rejected over and over again. And there's also rising opportunity costs. So there might be a lot of scope for policy innovation and bringing other sources of funding that we haven't tested. This has been mostly federal or federally funded programs or subnational programs. No experience with local matching funds. So again, an opportunity for the experts in that domain. And some aspects of the importance of building these types of long-term case studies. One word is here, laboratory, and Sophie has a lot of experience in laboratories as very useful spaces to examine longer-term issues that are not always amenable for single case studies, no? But they require presence above all, and network and interactions. An approach that I've taken from the beginning is question first, method later. So sometimes it leans more into environmental economics, very quantitative regression type of analysis, and other more leaning towards the critical social science. So I think there's opportunity for all because it allows you to tell us a more comprehensive picture of reality. An important part, work, and this is mostly an implication of the second, working collaboratively with people from diverse backgrounds and disciplines. In my case, Natura Ecosistemas Mexicanos, they're mostly biologists, ecologists. So it's very fascinating discussions to have with an economist. And if we add all the other social scientists, that's, you can imagine, very interesting discussions. And then last question, research and practice are not mutually exclusive, but they are challenging. When you devise programs that are research-based, but also have policy-making implications, there might be diverging interests and diverging priorities that have to be navigated from early on. What we know is that papers per se will not drive change. So they might be necessary, or not even necessary, but for sure they're not sufficient. So we need these broader collaborations. This is something, a theme that we've been discussing over and over again in this seminar. And that would be it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Santiago, for this call for collaboration. Really rich presentation built through time and effort. So we'll have one last presentation for this panel, which will be made virtually by Este Corbera.
Hello, everyone. I assume I have to share my screen.
I'm gonna see you on the screen.
All right.
So Este Corbera is a research professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. His research focuses on human-nature relationship and the impact of social policy and environmental change on resource governance. Specifically, he has conducted research on how policies for biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation, including payment for ecosystem services, have affected land use system, institution, and livelihood of rural people in the global south.
Jerome, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
All right, we can see you.
Yeah. Okay, great.
We can hear you. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
I have the echo. Could you cancel your mics, please? Thank you so much. Thanks, Jerome, for this kind introduction. Very kind of you. Thanks. And thanks to Santi and Sophie for the invitation to be part of these workshops. I'm so jealous to see some familiar faces in the room and not being with you. It's a difficult time for me with ending the school year for my kids and so on. I also apologize in advance because I will be leaving the workshop early once you break up for lunch because I have to put my kids to bed, etc. And I also want to sort of begin my presentation with an announcement. I think my presentation is less ambitious, less sophisticated than the others we've seen today. What I'm presenting is exploratory work. And in fact, I will be super grateful also on behalf of my co-authors to receive some suggestions on how to pursue this further, which is entitled How Mexico's PES Technical Assistance Affects Enrollment, Performance, and Collective Action. So this is all started with a master's dissertation that Santiago Izquierdo Tort, our own Santi, and myself, we supervised last year. And as I said, it's just an exploratory study. All of us here in this workshop, we know that evidence on PES effectiveness, including socio-ecological aspects as we've seen so far, but also motivational crowding effects and why people participate in PES at the start has mounted. All this evidence has mounted over the last 20 years. However, our argument goes to say that the role of technical assistance in PES implementation has received scant attention to date. And therefore, we ask, who has provided technical assistance in Mexico and which characteristics do these actors share? How do technical assistants perceive the contribution of PES to conservation and human well-being to be? And how have they engaged with local communities and their local institutions for conservation and resource management? At which scale, why, and with which level of perceived success? We pursued this question through an online survey sent to the 279 technical assistants included in CONAFOR's public registry as of May 2021. 21 of these assistants were unreachable, so our initial sample was 258 technical assistants. These are people, I will give more details in a minute, that provide support in PES or PES-like programs, but also in other programs promoted by CONAFOR, such as reforestation-focused programs or forest products value chains, etc. When we reached all these people by email, we encouraged them to participate by offering some Amazon vouchers. But even so, you can see we were not extremely successful, let's say, so we only got 55 responses back, and that is 21% of the total initial sample. So I have to say that this is exploratory, and on top of that, doesn't have a very strong representation of what's out there in terms of technical assistance. We then also contacted these 55 respondents to see whether we could also interview them. And you can see that we only received 3 people who were willing to be interviewed to basically dig deeper into some of the questions of the online survey. These 3 follow-up interviews are not used in the rest of the presentation. So basically the survey had a first phase in which we asked, a first block in which we asked about how these technical assistants conceptualize PES, what they thought were the instrument's main aims and achievements to date. And if these technical assistants had not provided assistance to PES programs, then they were simply asked why they had not provided this service, and the survey finished for them. If they had provided assistance, then we basically had 4 blocks in the survey. One was digging deeper into what kind of assistance they provided to local communities, how frequently they interacted with the beneficiaries, what were the challenges experienced in implementing the program, and what had been their role in building or hindering local collective action. So I go into the results. Out of these 55 people that responded to our survey, 11 belonged or were members of NGOs and forestry consultancies, and 44 worked alone as forestry professionals and consultants. Only 5 of them never provided technical assistance in PES programs, but they said they were willing to do so. NGOs and consultancies tend to file a higher number of applications, and they have a slightly higher acceptance rates and also PES renewal success. Individual technical assistants, however, tend to be more geographically spread than organizations, Yet the number of municipalities in which these different assistants operate is almost the same. It's an average of 3 municipalities per technical assistant. Reported activities are many. So what do these people do when they interact with local communities? And you can see them here on the screen. But the most important is to say that only organizations claimed consistently to implement all these activities in each community. And technical assistants working individually, so individual professionals, never reported investing in local equipment to support different kind of PS activities. How did these people understand PES? And when I present now very brief results, you can see how this resonates with the presentations we've had so far today. So most respondents believed, I would say quite rightly, that Mexico's PS programs have contributed positively or highly positively to avoided deforestation and biodiversity conservation. They are, however, less optimistic regarding the potential of PES in promoting equity, collective action, and local socioeconomic development. Yet, very few organizations and individual assistants, only 5 out of the 55 respondents, considered that PES could harm rural communities. These are 2 examples of things we asked in relation to PES conceptualization issues. For example, we asked people to say whether they agreed or disagreed with the following statements. In PES contracts, monetary incentives can erode the intrinsic motivations of communities and farmers to conserve. Here we can see on the graphs on your left that opinions were quite mixed and quite diverse, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. When we presented them with the statement in PES projects, conservation and social objectives are rarely achieved simultaneously, what we can see is that individual technical assistants, individual professionals tend to be much more optimistic about the possibility of win-win outcomes. This takes us to something that Santi said in his first presentation today, that PES for most of these technical assistants is really a win-settled policy. So well done, Santi. If we continue with the results, we also see that most of them believe that they have had a positive or strongly positive or at worst neutral impact on local participation in conservation activities, trust building, reduced forest resources extraction, and norm building. 23% of individual professionals acknowledge, however, and this is important, this is why it's in bold, that their activity has induced or could induce local conflicts. But organizations did not acknowledge this risk or this outcome. All respondents from organizations, however, acknowledge lack of funding to provide better assistance. And 30% of individual professionals have had difficulties in ensuring that participants comply with program activities, and 35% of them have struggled to gain enough local trust to design and establish successful PES initiatives. Both types of technical assistance, so both organizations-driven and individual-driven, acknowledge in the survey that additional conservation activities which go beyond the minimal requirements of CONAFOR are hardly ever implemented. And most of them, and this is important for design and the issues that Santi was mentioning in the last presentation, most of them consider that this need to collectively invest PES monies in collective projects has hindered rather than encouraged local participation. So what are my final thoughts of analyzing this survey together with Sol and Santi? The technical assistance in Mexico performed by individual professionals and both NGOs and consultancies is a good thing in the sense that it has ensured larger geographical coverage, because we would assume, and we've seen it in the data, that NGOs and consultancies tend to have a more sort of localized working area where they have worked for a longer period, and this is where they concentrate their PES applications, while individual professionals cover sort of more larger number of states and a larger number of municipalities. Positive perceptions of PES exist overall across the sample, yet individual technical assistants have more concerns about PES, and they experience many more challenges in terms of implementation. We hypothesize that this is due probably their short-term local engagement with the participant communities and fewer resources or lower capacity to build local social capital. And this resonates with something that Kelly Jones said in the previous panel, that well-established scholarship, there is a well-established scholarship on how intermediaries, mainly NGOs, can support conservation programs by strengthening local institutions and ensuring permanence. But also, and you are probably aware of this growing literature, intermediaries or technical assistants can also indeed induce conflict by being blind to elite capture or by being insufficiently transparent in the management of PES applications or sensitive to local institutional realities. So, one first follow-up research question: how does technical assistance influence PES compliance, environmental additionality, persistence over time, and social conflict? Could we analyze this spatially? Follow-up question 2. Why has going beyond the mandatory activities been so difficult for technical assistants to implement? Is it a matter of capacity and resources? Or there are other incentives and dynamics that undermine a more widespread conservation behavior? And I have added, while listening to Andrea, how does this perception of technical assistance match with her findings that PES lead to more PES and more forestry activities? There seems to be a contradiction between what they feel they can get out of communities in terms of conservation and what Andrea is observing in her data. So I can see at least one policy action that could derive out of this work. We may like to lobby CONAFOR to sponsor a workshop for PES assistance only, so that these people can share their experiences, can identify required trainings, and can maybe even develop a toolbox for better implementing technical assistance across Mexican communities, focused on RED, focused on PES, or incentive-based conservation more generally. And I have a policy request to make for any participants in the room or contacts you may have. Can we have, or someone has a database that identifies where and when each technical assistance has worked? Because that would allow us to map the influence of these people on the territory and on specific municipalities and communities, and then test some of the questions I highlighted before in this slide. So, thank you so much, especially to Santi, to Sophie, and all the rest of the PES Mexican community from which I continue to learn so much from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esteve, for this very original angle and perspective on PES. So I know that we don't want to run late too much for the lunch break, but maybe a couple of questions from the public here or online. Santi, I think you have access to online questions, if there are. Yeah, okay, well, there we have a question here.
Thank you. I just have some thoughts there, maybe not really a question, but there is some seemingly contradiction between what Sophie mentioned regarding this strengthening of networks of collaboration and the challenge that Santiago pointed out, where, if I understood correctly, most of these payments remain within the beneficiary groups, within these minority groups. So it's more like what are your thoughts regarding how can we reach out to other, to accelerate the impact, right? And to move this famous needle and to reach out to other groups, to strengthen or replicate whatever work there and lead to these more resilient networks participating in these programs? Anyway, I know it's a difficult question, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. I'll start with driving interest within the community. So one is all the kind of network constellation of stakeholders who can be involved in a program from the design implementation. This includes participants, but also technical assistants, NGOs, funders, and etc. I'll let Sophie answer more in that constellation. I'll answer more related to the driving interest within the communities. So what we've seen is that there's always been much more demand for the program than supply of funding. But when you explore within the communities, at least in this case, because of how land ownership works, is mostly individualized now. So even like communal land holdings have been individualized. So people manage them de facto as individual lands, although legally they are communal lands. No, in this sense, it really depends on what are the kind of livelihood trajectories that people choose, and what are the incentives that are provided for conservation versus those other alternatives. What we've seen is that when this started in 2007 in these communities in Selva Lacandona, even then when the payment became quite high, and it was 1,000 pesos in 2010, which was very much higher than the other programs. This was a subnational initiative called Programa Especial Selva Lacandona. A minority participated. Others were not interested at all, or were not compensated sufficiently through these payments to participate. So the high rate of individual land holdings at the community level was around 50% in some communities. It's now around 20 or 25%. So driving interest might not be always feasible nor desirable. I think what matters over this implementation over 20 years is to at least manage to keep those who want to continue being enrolled to participate, and to sustain these payments, knowing that effectiveness increases over time, at least in this context. So we cannot be too ambitious to say that everyone will want to participate. And it turns out in this context, because of the high deforestation rates, people who were able to participate or who were eligible 20 years ago are no longer eligible now, because there are no more forest land holdings. So in this context, and to put you an example, around 35 to 40% of forest cover remains of an original 100% 30 years ago. From this 40%, like 75% of this 40% is conserved already through payments. The rest is no longer eligible. So you would need to trigger or devise other programs that are less about conservation and more about restoration, and this transition from an agricultural field towards forest ecosystem. So my sense would be, let those who want to participate, allow them to continue to participate, and try to motivate others, but knowing that they might have other ideals. So, yeah.
Okay, so I have many ideas how to answer your question or your comment. First of all, I think it is different if we are talking about a federal program or a matching one. But in any way, once you have different institutions participating where you have the federal one, that brings one context, is what Kelly was saying previously, and that helps to create a local matching fund. So for instance, when you already have NGOs involved, communities interested in running the program and so on, then that makes an interesting context where other types of mechanisms can be created. But it's not only the diversity of institutions involved. It is good to have different ones. I mean, NGOs, government at different levels, and within the communities also different communities and so on. But it's not only that; it's the way they are relating each other. I mean, if really you have an actor influencing the information that is shared within different actors. If you have an institution in charge of regulation or monitoring, so you can have different roles within those institutions. So the diversity is bringing also different kind of compromises that helps, you know, to have all these like all these aspects that are needed, as Santi was saying, you know, not only the economic view but also the social equity and so on. So that's what we did. It was very simple, but if you look at that at different levels, you can see how this information and the relationships are changing on time and space. And I think that's we can still study more deeply into those relationships. Yeah.
Thank you for a really interesting set of presentations, and seeing the connections between them is just fascinating. So I'm so appreciative of your work. The question actually is about perceived benefits of the program. So Robert, it's getting back to a very small point you make in a very large study. And you may be able to answer. I know you have many collaborators in the room as well. And Santiago and Esteve, it sounded as if maybe you had done a similar study on participants' perceived benefits from the program. I was fascinated by your what I understood to be your results as finding that the economic benefit of participation was very low down on the list in terms of what participants perceived to be a benefit of participation. And I'm wondering a couple of questions. One is that, did I get it right? And then the other one is, has there been any analysis based on the characteristics of the participants to look at how the characteristics of the participants influence perceived benefit? So looking at that kind of relation. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So probably also if Kelly's around, she also can can jump in. So I think the first thing is that if you see the percentage, like 8% of the income of households, that probably is not too much. But if you compare it with other social programs are representing 12%. So I mean, it's not that distance between 8 and 12. I think so that if you compare with that, so the PS could be an interesting program in terms of compensating or adding a little bit more of those programs, because actually they use that for basic needs also. Once the money is getting into the household, as Santiago was saying, no, the amount of the program that is going for conservation, the community decides how to use it. But once you have the money within the household, it's used for basic needs. So I think that is interesting, and that brings me to another comment, that is, we need to think about those incentives in combination not only with other environmental policies, but also with other social policies running into the landscape. Because if we want, and if we think that the PES needs to meet environmental and social goals, I mean, we need to see that into a more broader sense. That's for one thing. And your second question was your variation. So that's the other paper that Kelly was leading, is about the perceptions. And so mainly what we were saying is that participants are looking other non-tangible benefits, and that is very important. So people is not only there for the economic increase of income. I'm sure that in La Candona you can see also that kind of things, and in other regions, in Oaxaca too. So what is really happening is that most of the people that is receiving these kind of programs, they see the program as an opportunity, sometimes for land saving, I say, and also to receive a little bit more for one land that they are not using. So it's worth just to, I mean, it's convenient for them. There is, I mean, there are some differences between the ones that receive and not on their perceptions, but mainly we can see like general appreciation that there are positive perceptions on the program. Mm-hmm. Another question?
Hi. How does the program Sembrando Vida interact with PES? Is there any overlap, or is it affecting it negatively?
Well, there's zero overlap. And actually, we had some discussions about it, just the differences in the approach of the government agency, the CONAFOR being very open with the data and inviting researchers and teams to come in and monitor and give feedback and improve the program. And Sembrando Vida being very closed. I think there was a few studies early on that were critical, and they became very sensitive to any type of criticism, and so it's been really difficult to do any kind of work with Sembrando Vida. The other big difference, I think, is the CONAFOR. It's an annual program, so every year they have a convocatoria, and so you can be modifying that all the time and improving it based on the scientific feedback. Whereas in Sembrando Vida, they just had 2 years. I think it was open, and then it's been running just with those participants over time. So the opportunities for improvement, it was a very narrow window, and just we weren't able to get in. So yeah, and they're different. CONAFOR is in Seminat, and then Sembrando Vida is in Bienestar, separate government, secretaries. So, but it's also very interesting. There's overlap also with SADER, with the agricultural sector, because they're increasing, for example, coffee production by 90,000 hectares. And all of that money for coffee is going into the secretariat that has nothing to do with agriculture. So there's some balancing between the government agencies, and but it seems like they could have a huge impact, but nobody knows exactly how they're doing. So
if I can add to that, the experience in Selva Lacandona, I would say no institutional overlap, but spatial overlap entirely. It's the same people. And the subscription in these communities was really high, much higher than PCA. In some communities, practically all ejidatarios. And if they were allowed to include their family members, so you would have more than ejidatarios. In some places, at least like 2 or 3 times more, at parcels of 2.5 hectares. What we saw, the beginning, when the first rolling out, there's been 2 phases. The first one was the most significant in late 2018, early 2019. Some substitution of lands and conservation towards those parcels, and leading to deforestation in this very timely, like in this process in 2019. Since then, what we've seen is a very significant rise in incomes and consumption in the region. So to put an example, what have been documented over the last 10 years, in real terms, around 6,000 pesos per household on average. This program is 5,000 or 4,500 per participant. And if some households can 2 or 3 people participate, it's already 16,000, 18,000. So it's, in some households, it's doubling their income or tripling their income in the last 2 or 3 years. And we've been seeing the results of this on use of some, let's say, durable goods, transportation, trucks, and these types of consumptions, household improvements too. So what remains to be seen is to what extent this additional income might translate to land use or land cover. We haven't really tried to assess that. As Robert said, there's very little access to data, so it mostly relies like on our knowledge on who is participating, but access to the land plots as we have in CONAFOR, it's not feasible. So what I would say is an initial rise in deforestation caused directly by substitution of land, and since then we don't really know. They might have helped people who wanted to conserve and use those income for other types of things, or it might trigger further deforestation. We don't really know for sure.
Steve, you wanted to add something?
No. Santi just said it, that it's the spike we saw in deforestation in the area. It's one of the papers that is forthcoming and that we attributed to, at least speculatively, we attributed it to Sembrando Vida, but Santi just said it. Thank you.
All right, so I would like to thank you all, the speakers, for this great panel. And we're going to break for lunch and start back at 2:15. Okay, thanks again.